but yeah, 747 BC is the period which the later Greeks saw as the sort of beginning of the age of a far more sophisticated system of bureaucracy in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. The history could be continually traced back to Babylon. The records, astrological records and all that could be traced continuously back to his reign.
Right. The traditional, whether it's accurate or not, the traditional dating of the first Olympian game was 776 BC, which is easy to remember since U.S. Declaration of Independence is supposedly 1776. So just strike a one and make that BCE. But you have to think, given this kind of understanding that the launch of the Olympian Games and the other three were part of a concerted effort to begin restructuring their own culture to try to get out of the Dark Age and not go back into it. You have to think they must have spent some decades before that scratching their heads and working on the problem of, okay, how are we going to proceed here? How are we going to make this go? Because by the time the Olympian Games show up, you've already got more than wrestling. You've already got playwrights and poets, and they're doing cultural work and religious work as well as athletic work. So I've heard it called the Olympian Project, and I've heard it called the Homeric Project. But either word works to say now is where we're going to start. We're going to start making. We're going to start deliberately reshaping ourselves to get out of this mess we made.
Well, we discussed this kind of earlier in regard to the Roman thing, right? Wasn't it, or at least the Catholic Church? It started with a lot of disparate ideas, and then there comes a period of consolidation.
Right.
The consolidation is, you could say, whether that's a government or whether it's an empire, is a consolidation that, in a sense, is an attempt to sustain whatever the culture is, or whatever the epoch is, and then the dissolution. So the consolidation aspect is kind of important in one sense. It's also, it leads to, in a way, its demise, but it was a necessary process.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, it's I'm glad Stephen's calling attention to this question of where's the boundary, where's the transitional period between the archaic and the classical? Because for all that the classical era defined itself in terms of the heroic period that came before, you still couldn't confuse them with each other. I mean, their value system and their intentions, despite all the tropes being the same, right? Here's Hercules, here's Zeus, blah, blah, blah. The intent and the relationship to the material is so different. Starting with the Homeric Project, it starts to become so deliberate and conscious, and not merely taken for what we naively interpret it as, but now taken for what can we make of this? What can we draw out of this to help put our thumb on the scale as far as our own outcome and whether we're going to make it or not? It's fascinating.
Don't you think that it was the defeat of the Persian Empire? I mean, starting with Xerxes, well, Darius actually, because the Persian Empire was, in some sense, the inheritor of the Middle East. I mean, it was the latest empire. It was really the first true empire. Maybe the Syrians were, but they took over the Syrians, and then and the Babylonians, and these upstarts, that fought in the at the Asia Minor, ended up beating them back. But they must have realized that despite beating them back, these Persians were incredibly organized. I mean, so maybe that's what led Athens to think, we could become organized as well, and therefore along with it, the Athenian Empire, which never succeeded, but nonetheless. So I wonder whether that wasn't learning from the enemy, even though they beat them. But I think they knew that was kind of a lucky break, as much as skill. You know what I mean? It's like they happen to have that straight did turn out, and so and then of course Alexander. But so that seems interesting. I mean, the whole Middle Eastern thing is kind of interesting anyway, because before the Babylonians was the what were the people before that?
The Mesopotamian, Sumerian,
yeah, that collection of city states.
Neo-Assyrian. Yeah, there's a whole series of empires that replace each other one after another in quick succession. Yeah, it's interesting, and one of Kenneth Smith's favorite quotes is a Roman who's quoting an earlier Roman who's quoting a Greek. There's a telescoping that's happening, and it's talking about it was an observation made when the defeated Macedonian king was being taken in triumph to Rome, because the Romans had finally conquered the Macedonian Empire, and they're like, this is the best thing ever. We beat them. We must be more than a bunch of crazy Italian hill tribes. We're really something if we could take down Alexander's empire. And they did some quotes on the occasion about the history involved, and said, do you suppose that when the Macedonians had conquered the Greeks and then conquered the whole known world, did they have even the faintest idea that in such a short time later on they'd be gone, and Rome would be the empire to replace them? And to make that point, he quotes a Macedonian quoting about the Persian Empire, and said how it once ruled the world and now it's hardly even a name of a place anymore. Macedonia has now taken all of this. And the Romans are saying, this is creepy, because here we are in our moment of triumph, just like the Macedonians were earlier in their moment of triumph. And fortune only gave them the gift of domination. They only lent it to them for a little while before taking it away again. And the Romans are going, I wonder how long we're going to be allowed by fortune to be the top dog before fortune takes it away from us too.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that might actually be the explanation of Rome ever expanding. Remember, they have to have a buffer zone, and of course, once they have the buffer zone, they have to get another buffer zone, and so that might have started from that paranoia about we don't want to be go down like the Greeks and the Persians, and so forth.
Yeah.
So that ever expansion becomes kind of like a safety valve for not being in dissolution from their success. So maybe that was sort of like, oh, this is our secret for not being like the Persians and the Greeks. So I mean, it's that never occurred to me that I always found that to be a peculiar little thing. Like, we always have to expand, and they called that. I think they thought of that as a defensive maneuver rather than an offensive maneuver. And of course, we thought of it as an empire that expanded and was offensive, but maybe that was just merely a protection, like building greater walls, except by the armies. So that's interesting. Thank you for making me realize that might be a relationship.
Yeah, I bring it up because it just strikes me the extent to which the entire Olympian project of the classical Greeks was done with this acute sense of the mortality of their own predecessors, who they still, at the time they began the Olympian project, were thinking of as better than they were, and yet they'd screwed up on such a profound level. And then it's only a few centuries later that the Greeks are reflecting on the defeat of the Persians And then just a little while after that, that the Macedonians are reflecting on the defeat of the Greeks. And then just a few centuries later, the Romans are reflecting on the defeat of the Macedonians. This sense of impermanence and mortality, and that a culture or civilization is an organism, and it's born and it flourishes and it dies. That awareness that they weren't going to be around forever. It's really hard to convey that to moderns, because we think we're at the end of history, and from here on out it's just, yeah, there may be some road warrior-esque nonsense in the meantime, but we sort of imagine all going to the stars and becoming Star Trek, and we'll be like gods, and this is the end of history. That we really don't talk about our own foredoomed mortality as a civilization the way that this entire succession of cultures did openly in writing and in their parliaments routinely. And they didn't wait until they had already collapsed to go, say, do you suppose we might fail someday? They're like, at the moment of triumph, they have these big open debates about, we're not the first ones to triumph like this. And the last people who triumphed like this, we just kicked their butts. So, check the clock, everybody.
Well, no, I could understand. I could understand the modern perspective, though. We have learned to become rational, and we will educate everybody in terms of reason, and so we're never going to struggle on that brutal aspect. Although we clearly do that, in a sense, once they come to understand, how enlightened we are, how enlightened they could be, we will never go down that path again, and so therefore there's no need for that. Certainly, in the meantime, it's gotten worse, so we're blind to that aspect. So yes. That's interesting.
Well, we have some interpretation of Daniel's prophecy along those lines, that the one empire will succeed another, and you have the writing on the wall.
Yes. You have the Persian. I can't remember whether it was Xerxes or Darius or who goes to the oracle at Delphi and says, this whole thing where I attack the Greeks, is this going to work out? And the response is, if you invade Greece, a great empire will fall. And he goes, great, I'm going to make that happen. And the oracle's going, oh no, you didn't listen carefully, did you? You two are a great empire. So this quote I put here from Demetrius of Phalerum, he's quoted by a later Roman. That's the source we have. And so this is where the telescoping happens, because here's Demetrius talking about, the Macedonians beating the Persians, and it's the later Macedonian king who's quoting Demetrius of Phalerum at the time of his own being paraded through Rome as a defeated empire that's gone now. That he recalls Demetrius of Phalerum's words, which we're recalling and wondering about how the Persians felt when the Macedonians kicked their butt. So this quote comes from earlier in this very book. If it looks familiar, that's because it was in Fugitive Images, which we did over a year ago. And I'm bringing it up because as we talk about, the very next paragraph in section F, Mythos and Logos, is talking about the Olympian project and the Olympian religion. And it's when I was younger, I always thought of that as, myths are fun, myths are cool. Here's Hercules, here's blah, blah. It was just, entertainment and interest. But now that I understand the Olympian project better, I always think about it in terms of a civilization that's acutely aware of its mortality, trying to figure out how best to harness the resources it has in order to try to avoid, or at least postpone, the sort of disaster that happened to its predecessor. And that they worked so hard at it, that they really used all the tools at their disposal and still failed. I mean, they had a few good centuries, but they still tore themselves to pieces and got beaten by the Macedonians. And that tragedy of that situation happening in basically complete awareness of it in real time because they made them all read Homer, because every Olympian game they recited the entire Iliad from beginning to, and not just the Iliad, they recited the whole cycle of epics of the Trojan War from beginning to end, and that was the duration of the Olympian game. How long did it take them to tag team their way through, so that everybody would hear it over and over and over and over? The best and the brightest were reminded over and over. And all I can think about is, in high school, Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, which we did in high school, and I was cast in the role of the guy who's whispering into Caesar's ear, "Beware the Ides of March." Right? And, the practice of having the Caesar have somebody constantly reminding them, "You're mortal. All of this is going to pass. You're going to pass. Don't get your head too swollen." And how different is that from the modern? Do we surround our presidents with people to whisper in their ear, "Don't be too egotistical. Our civilization is going to collapse someday. Your job is to postpone that"?
It seems
We win.
but it seems strange and almost contrary to reasonable thinking that always a lesser power end up defeating the greater power. I mean, it doesn't seem reasonable. Maybe there's something wrong with reason. I mean, every one of them is like it was undermined by a lesser power that should never have won.
Yes.
Never should have won, but nonetheless they did. So that's in some sense that's kind of frightening.
Yeah. And then right before that, he has this quote from Black Hawk, which, by the way, a year and a half ago, when we did that chapter and I talked it through, I made a major blunder. I said, obviously he meant Black Elk, but Black Elk and Black Hawk are two completely different people. And this is definitely Black Hawk. He got the quote right. I know about Black Hawk and Black Elk. And I'm going to take this moment to remind us that no matter how smart you are, no matter how educated you are, even if the material you're talking about is your favorite material that you know better than you know anything else, mortal brains are idiots. I mean, that day, for whatever reason, my brain collapsed Black Elk and Black Hawk into the same person. And I proudly declaimed for the recording and for all of you that Kenneth had made an error in his attribution, which he did not. It's completely right. Black Elk was the man with the shamanic background and visions who's is recorded in Black Elk Speaks and in another, the medicine pipe. Black Hawk is the general who fought successful wars against the United States, and he wrote an autobiography from which this is drawn. So, but again, this is the same theme in some ways that Demetrius of Phalerum and the later Macedonian king are reflecting upon, which is this how. What paragraph we're in? We haven't actually got to the paragraph yet. We're doing our opening remarks. Joseph, we'll come to this shortly. So yeah, that how much other cultures were comfortable, and that's not exactly the right word, but were comfortable with their own mortality. That they regularly talked about it. That they regularly talked about it at their moments of greatest triumph. That they didn't hedge and say, well, if we screw up, then, I suppose our civilization won't last forever, but obviously it'll last for thousands and thousands of years. That's not a normal perspective. We take it for granted. The Nazis talk about the 1,000-year Reich, and, while on the one hand, we're like, haha, we beat you, screw you, you don't get a 1,000-year Reich. Part of the reason we say that is because our unconscious is saying, we get the 1,000-year civilization. It is not you, it is we that are going to last forever and fly in starships in the stars. We, as moderns, we sort of are not willing to look death candidly in the face the way that most other cultures in the history of the world have. And one of the things that he's struggling to do in this book is to dislodge from us the most dangerous of all the ideologies associated with being stuck inside a single worldview. And that is the idea that we are in any position to make claims about what human nature is. Right? If we say it's human nature to not think about death, which you can, if you Google that, or search the New York Times archives or what have you, you'll find countless people who say, well, obviously it's normal to forget about the fact that you're going to die and blah, blah, blah. It's like, but the evidence says that that's not true. The evidence says it's normal for moderns to not think about death and mortality. But what we find in all these examples is that in healthier cultures, that are healthier in this regard, it's normal to confront death directly and walk through all the days of your life as an individual or as a civilization, always with one eye on how much time do we have left? What can we do to stack the deck in our favor and get a little more health out of this? Because we aren't going to be here forever. That was normal before modernity. All right, let's turn to questions, and I'll get us to the text later. But let's do Zelig and then Stephen and then Phil. Go ahead, Zelig. Come off mute.
Hey, how's it going, Rick?
Hey.
Yeah, now that you bring up kind of these ancient civilizations, I recently watched on Netflix a documentary called Ancient Civilizations, where a journalist, I'm sure you probably heard of him, I forgot his name, but he goes and he tries to expand the horizon of what present archaeologists say that human civilization started, and he manages to push back the dates even further as to how soon humans started civilization. And it's true, right? And these archaeologists refuse to expand their horizon because their worldview will be forced to change as to we were not just these hunter-gatherers that were just simplistic. We were extremely advanced, and a great cataclysm happened that wiped out those civilizations that managed to create the pyramids with understanding of pi and in areas that we till this day don't even know how they came to find pi, for example. Like they don't document, they just take it as an assumption that they know what they're using. So if it's true that an ancient civilization has been wiped out, and it was more advanced than the Greeks were, than the Babylonians were, than the Egyptians were, that's going to have us to recalculate everything that we perceive to be that they were probably aware or that they were going to be destroyed, and they cultivated that in their culture. The Aztec culture did. And so it's true what you're saying. Like, these cultures cultivated the idea that the destruction was imminent and it can happen again. And if it turns out to be true that there was a great cataclysm that destroyed this ancient civilization way before the ones we know today, like it just makes sense of what you're saying. It's just like we refuse to expand our horizons because we believe that we're the end all be all.
Yeah, we have a really myopic view of history in which we assume that all the interesting progress has happened now. It was us. Mm-hmm. And anybody we're willing to bless as being our forebears, we'll let them have made a little bit of progress. But we assume that everybody else is, just ignorant primitives who didn't do anything, and we're just waiting for glorious us to come along and enlighten the world. It's you're talking about Graham Hancock.
Yes.
And the trick with his material is always to separate the archaeology he's doing from the white supremacy, because he's drawing off the tradition that goes back to Chariots of the Gods and the Swiss and German schools that said dark-skinned people could never have had architecture or science because they're too primitive. So there must have been a bunch of white people who had a fallen civilization, but before that, they enlightened all the savages around the world, and they built all the pyramids and they made all the talent. And Graham Hancock's careful never to say that part out loud. But every so often he slips up. But where Graham Hancock is useful is if you can put that stuff aside and say, okay, that's just white supremacist detritus. But the rest of what he's talking about, the idea that the people we consider primitive, maybe could do a lot more than we think they could, and maybe the whole impression of them as being primitive is not actually justified by the evidence, but rather is our need as moderns to fit history into this picture in which everything was awful till we came along and we made it all good.
Right. And that's something that my ancestors, right? Because I'm Mexican, and
Yeah.
I always grew up with the understanding that Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent, was this bearded man that came from the ocean. And so, and it's in the history of the drawing.
Right.
So to us, that was always a great mystery as to who was this man who definitely physiologically was not like the people that were living in what's today known as North America or Mexico. And to hear Hancock mention that, it's like, yeah, we've had those that history. And when you look at stories like, for example, the Tower of Babel, right, and where God disperses them across the world, and they're building the ziggurats, and you see that these pyramids are everywhere, you know that the story there, it has something to do with the flood, a great cataclysm. And it's interesting that you mentioned about the white supremacy stuff. And I'm pretty sure that kind of, these views that you would find like today on Reddit, right, where they're conspiratorial and all of that, and most of these extreme places, they hold some truth to appeal to people. And that's what makes it appealing and believable, right? And so hopefully, we can get rid of the whole white supremacy and touch upon the topic that the Aztecs did talk about, right? Quetzalcoatl, or the feathered serpent that came on a ship or a vehicle from the ocean. That's going to revolutionize how we understand the Aztecs and the Mayans, for example. Like it really does link us back to an ancient history that is going to have us to adjust our worldviews, like you're mentioning, our scopes, right? Our horizons have to be expanded further than what we thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Along the lines of what you're saying, the best thing to come out of Graham Hancock's works, I've read a lot of his books. The best part, if you comb away the nonsense and focus in on his valuable parts, the best thing that he's done is really lobby for the idea that since human beings tend to settle along coasts and rivers, you have to ask yourself, before the glaciers melted, where were the coasts? Yeah. And the answer is they're in places that are now underwater.
Yes.
And so whatever people were building 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 years ago, we're not going to find them along today's coast. We're going to find them out in water. And in hindsight, it's blindingly obvious. And yet, before Jacques Cousteau modernized scuba equipment and underwater photography, it just wasn't practical to conduct underwater archaeology. So I feel like over the rest of our lives, of the decades to come, I think this is the part where Graham Hancock, I think, is right on. We're going to be seeing a lot of breakthroughs in archaeology as people stop saying, well, I didn't find anything along today's coastline, so nobody must have built anything. And instead they search another 100 feet out underwater and go, oh my God, look at all these towns and villages on what used to be the coast, right? And as the water levels rise, 8,000 BCE, of course, everywhere on Earth, there's going to be stories of people coming from the sea.
And I'm willing to take Graham Hancock along the same line to Henry Ford. We know that he was ignorant, a racist, and a bigot, but he gave us the vehicle in spite of him. You know what I mean? And he, as a matter of fact, the vehicle allowed us to undermine his worldview. Being able to travel into places that normally were segregated. So
right. Has a huge impact. And so, that's where what you're talking about really plays into the theme we're talking about here is, as we make these breakthroughs in archaeology and history, we come to understand that the old 19th century picture of, civilization arising from the primitives doesn't work. Whether it's the Antikythera device or whether it's, Babylonian astronomical star charts, or whether it's the discovery, which I love so much from the last 10, 20 years, that all of the Mayan pyramids are built atop cenotes, which, are these limestone eroded caverns that were full of clean, fresh water. And And they're,
Yeah.
what are they doing? They're protecting their water sources.
Yeah.
And they're putting a big weight on top, to make
Yeah.
sure it doesn't erode, doesn't fall apart. Their vision of the afterworld with the gods is entirely tied up with access to water.
Yeah.
We didn't know this stuff in the 70s when I was first getting into Mayan archaeology and Aztec archaeology. But, what we discover is all over the world, people were working on learning about their lives and their land and solving their problems, and they came up with amazing solutions
And
that
I'll say
it's
this
taken us a long time to clue in about.
And I'll say this one last thing to put my time, cut it, not take over the time. But recently they were interviewing someone, basically amateur archaeologists, where they discovered that the ancients had a way to cut volcanic rock to like the hundreds of thousands, and they discovered that it had to do with the tool that would allow to make precision cuts, and we did not have that understanding of how to use those tools until the Industrial Revolution. And these in Chinese and in Japanese culture, they were cutting rocks precisely to the thousandths of an inch, micrometers.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're just discovering that, right? And the thing is that we were arrogant enough to think like, oh no, they couldn't have done that because we figured it out in the industrial age. So how could they? That has to be made with hands or with chisels. And it's like, no, modern engineering says, nah, like in order to make those precision cuts, you need to have a precision tool. And we're discovering those tools. And so it's completely, we're living in an era where ancient civilizations will be, our worldviews are gonna have to change, and it's gonna have to readjust as to how we view America, right? And in Greece and Egypt, where did the Babylonians get their insights, or the Egyptians? And it's going to be interesting to see that it was on this side of the world. So to me, that's just fascinating.
Thanks, Selig. All right, Stephen, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'd be curious with the Mesoamerican cultures. Not so much about their pyramids, but I'd love to have seen if they were engaging in philosophy. Unfortunately, the Spanish came along and thought their stuff was all wicked. Therefore, we're going to burn it or something like that. So it's a bit tragic.
Yeah,
that's a bit that would fascinate me. Would we see what's essentially a Bronze Age civilization? Do we see the signs of that turning point, the axial age, beginning to show up there?
Right.
That would be the great curiosity. I was just going to say about this idea about permanence of civilization, where you've referred to the idea of the city of God, that the Christians came along and thought, well, the reason your cultures were falling is because you were putting faith in man. We have God on our side. And so they had this massive thing where God was on our side. And then we got into more the modern era. And of course, we had Feuerbach, who gave God the sack. Took the kingdom of God, gave God the sack, and put man in his place.
Right.
Only some complaints from Max Stirner. How dare you?
Yeah.
How dare you appropriate my humanity and raise it as a God above me? How dare you? But maybe that's the element that the modern culture has actually taken, that city of God idea, minus the God.
Yeah.
And now regards itself as the heavenly, in this case, material Jerusalem. Marx rewrote it as the material Jerusalem that is going to just last forever.
Right. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you can see in Marx, it's very interesting the way he talks about what the nature of the transition from modernity to which he calls capitalism, but he's just focused on the economy. But from modernity to whatever is going to come next, he focuses on the revolution. He focuses on the process of learning to do without the government structures of modernity, that they will wither away and we won't need them anymore, and then we will be in the new thing. And again, you get this sense of, and then history's over. There's this way that moderns, even when they think they're being contra-modern, have a tendency to slip into this sort of soteriological salvation metaphor from the medieval era. Even the most hard-headed atheists frequently model history as there will be an act of salvation, and after that, it's eternity. We'll be living in a status quo for eternity. The ancient idea that it's organisms all the way down. There isn't some point at which it's no longer organisms, that every culture and every civilization is necessarily mortal, and that whatever comes next after modernity, it may have its ways in which it's better than modernity, but it will also have its flaws, and it too will have its rise, its flourishing, its fall, and its death, just like any other epoch of history. This is really tough for moderns, and it's weird. This is one of the things that's the hardest. When you use the metaphor of Daedalus trapped in his own labyrinth and unable to get out of it until he thinks in a new dimension, vertically, you apply that to what is it like trying to think as a modern and trying to get out of being stuck in the modernist worldview. You can, buying their way out, right? Our metaphor is there must be some way I can purchase something here. But even the people who most set themselves against modernity, even the people who crown themselves, I'm the contrarian par excellence, I'm the one who will critique everything that's wrong with modernity, and I'll tell you how it's going to be. Nevertheless, their prescription for what's going to happen ends up following the same pattern as every other noetic modernist prescription. They may pick different targets for what's going to be knocked off the pedestal, but their story of how it's all going to work ends up being a modern story. We can't seem to even rebel against modernity without doing it in a modern way that perpetuates modernity. It's the strangest thing. And I think it's something the Greeks had an easier time with, and maybe the ancients generally, than we do. It's why they could write Oedipus Tyrannus and say, here is a very smart guy trying to solve problems, but he can only think within the framework he's trapped within. And every attempt he makes to get out perpetuates and advances the tragedy instead of getting him out of the tragedy. And the Greeks it's why Sophocles won that competition with that play. It's like, behold the ways in which the tools we use to try to escape our trap are part of the trap. That's something they could see more clearly than we can. We have a hard time with that.
Well, you could imagine Greeks sailing around the Mediterranean and coming to Egyptian ports and Phoenician ports, and they would have been saying, oh no, the Greeks are back in town.
Don't ask them about Oedipus. Don't get them started. Oh God, it's that Diogenes fellow. Don't ask him what he's doing with his lantern.
I could just sort of imagine the Greeks, getting high on the vino and running around the streets, and a bit like English soccer hooligans.
Yeah. Well, how did they seem to everybody else? Phil, what's on your mind?
Yeah, this discussion has led me more and more to maybe understand fate. That we as moderns don't appreciate that enough. I'm going to say briefly two generals to begin the story and then end the story. Napoleon once said, I'd rather have a lucky general on my side than a smart general. It sounds contrary, right? I think that he might be tapping into this whole thing about fate in this sense. Like he is talking about, I'm not going to use the terms I would usually use, how the finite consciousness deals with the infinite possibilities. I'm just going to talk about the known and the unknown. We as human beings, at best, even the most rational and reasonable person that we could be, could deal with only the knowns. Now, we try to mediate that with things like the unknown unknowns, right? The hidden variable. Or we mediate that with insurance that will mediate the risk. All these things, to in a sense, in essence, deal with the unknown fate that will befall us, right? And we think that we could manage fate by these sort of technical devices, manage the black swan, so to speak. Okay, so that's interesting. And maybe you can never really manage it. Maybe you could mediate it to a certain degree, but you can never really manage it. And I'm not going to speak against insurance and all these other factors of mitigation. But nonetheless, there's always something that's beyond, that's the mystery that we do not know, And of course, Einstein was always looking for the hidden variable beneath the quantum physics. He was convinced there is, and many of us are still searching for it. There is a rational thing. We just have to see the mystery that's behind it and turn the mystery into a kind of rational structure. This is something I'm not sure, but I've heard that there was once a Chinese general who, after a great victory, started crying. And my first thought was like, oh, like what an empathetic guy. He's actually crying for all those dead people that, like he slaughtered and all that. And he was asked, like, why are you crying? You should not be celebrating. And he said, I'm crying for the future that will be me. Right? And so that's interesting. Like he already understands that what is will be destroyed by the fate, and he will be a fallen person as well. So that's a showing of this. And I think it's important to know this, that we as individuals, or even as a civilization, cannot totally mitigate the unknown and the fate that would befall us. So I asked that question, why is it that this pipsqueak you should have no trouble defeating ends up beating you, right? So in some sense, like you never know what's going to come from. I remember having this discussion with somebody, like sometimes, when you're out in the boonies, so to speak, which I was for most of my life in relationship to this people that come from New York City, they know everything. And I always warn people, when you go out and speak, never be totally arrogant, because there's always somebody there, unbeknownst to you, who actually knows something. So don't treat them as fools, because there's always a hidden variable in there. And I found this out, when that's the case, many times has happened. And I only found this out because I lived in New York. And I found out, yes, there's some very, very smart people in New York City. Very smart, very connected. But there's also a lot of fools. And the fools, the badge they wear is like, they're from New York City. You're just a visitor. You don't know anything. Someday I should tell you the story about, trying to get a bank account in New York City. It's fascinating. I am writing a nasty letter to Citibank, and I concluded with, you are fond of saying that the city never sleeps. I said, perhaps your workers are suffering from a lack of sleep. So anyway, I just think that, we have to think about that we are not in control of our fate totally. We can mitigate it. And I do advise you to try to mitigate it, In other words, have some reserves. I mean, so many of us are living on the edge of vulnerability, excess vulnerability by, like, I'm just shocked that at least 50% of Americans have less than $400 in the total wealth saving.
Yeah.
I mean, you're walking the tightrope a little too much, right? So you can mitigate some of these things. You can't mitigate the black swan come swooping down. So that is beyond your control. So I'll just end it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I'm glad that in recent months you started talking about the black swan statistics. I've in the last month I started doing some reading about it because you brought it up, and reading the statistician who's the one who made black swan a famous term, and also fat tail distributions and other kinds of statistical, what most statisticians call statistical anomalies. But as he points out, the perfect, beautiful bell curve that satisfies all our theories is the exception, not the rule. And that because people expect things to be bell curves, but they actually aren't, and because they expect to focus on the middle of the curve where the majority is as the important part, and to ignore the outliers as, well, that's just noise, it sets themselves up for those moments when, one event destroys their entire, value as a corporation. But they were ignoring that because it was an outlier. And it makes me think again about punctuated equilibrium and modern theories of evolution, which say it's not the center of the curve that moves. It's the center of the curve that dies when the conditions change. And some weirdo outlier who has been struggling all this time because they weren't well suited to the conditions abruptly is exactly right for the new conditions. And they're the ones that can reproduce and become the center of the new bell curve. And the old center is collapsed and gone. And thus the species changes, except that's not actually what happened. What happened is diversity was rewarded by somebody out there had the arete that we needed for the new conditions. But the price was their lives sucked up until that moment. They were the poorest. Nobody liked them. They were the ugly duckling until the day came when ugly ducklings were exactly what you need. So I'm gonna take us to the text in a moment. My last step before going to the text, based on this discussion, and we've been focusing on this issue of the ways in which the ancients' worldview is so different from ours, in part because of their awareness of their mortality and the lengths they were willing to go to try to focus their civilizations towards that problem. Whereas we do the opposite, right? You talk about how little savings most people have, how close they are to bankruptcy. This is modernity, right? Modernity is about efficiency of profit. So the idea is you squeeze things as far as you can right to the edge of collapse. Because if you go too far, it collapses and it all falls apart. So you try to push it right to the edge, because if you push it any less than right to the edge, well, that's profit you're missing out on. So you have to push a little more until you're just a hair's breadth from the edge. And that's efficiency. You're now getting the maximum return on investment you can. But the price is nature's not steady. It's full of jostling. And the very first time that house of cards is jostled, it comes down because it has no reserves, wasted profit, has no reserve potential that could absorb the impact and allow the survival of the system. So the drive for short-term profits inexorably leads to this creation of fragile systems that can't actually handle change, catastrophic change. And as the new statistics point out, black swan events happen. You don't just say, if a black swan event happens, well, then we'll deal with it. It's like, no, a black swan event is going to happen. That's the normal course of evolution in history. Nobody knows when, and you've got to make sure your system has enough resiliency that when it occurs, you can respond to it like a shock absorber. And if you have a mindless, noetic, rationalist drive to hollow out all the institutions of society, including people's bank accounts, in order to maximize your short-term return on investment, you're going to wreck everything the first time a hurricane comes along. And thus, in otherwise, that line I quote over and over from Kenneth Smith, which is, you know, two cars collide at an intersection and all the houses fall down for blocks around. It was a catastrophe. The builders had been counting on a hurricane hitting first. And that's his parable. And of course, the reason they're counting on a hurricane is to cover up the fact that all these houses were so shoddy that even a car accident in an intersection, the vibrations are enough to make all the houses fall down because they were all cutting into their margins as far as they could. They didn't care if it all collapsed. They just didn't want to be held accountable for it. They wanted an act of God to cover up their malfeasance. You know, every time I read that thing, I'm like, Jesus, this is Kenneth at his best. It's on the one hand, it seems so cynical, but on the other hand, when you actually look at what we do to our own institutions, when you look at why did Hurricane Katrina, why did the levees fail? It's exactly this reason. People were hollowing out the institutions to make a buck. And the price is catastrophe and devastation. And yet, unless it comes back to bite the people who did the hollowing out, they just turn around and do it again next time because they managed to escape accountability. And the institutions are constantly pressuring new people to make the same decision next time. It's a stupid way to run a civilization. Joseph, you got your hand up. Go ahead. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so basically, I was just you actually just covered what I was about to say with, if you're not meant to pay the consequences, in the sense that the idea of too big to fail, where the system it's not a regenerative system. It's a system that's dependent on just de-risking, and where it has to step in and actually fix things. And it's only fixing it it's like a Band-Aid over something that's much more serious. Where the problem is, systemic. It's not necessarily something that it's not something you can barely gloss over. So the idea of not being able to let banks fail, to begin with, that's the problem. Like, that's the fundamental problem, is that's where things kind of go wrong, and that you don't have a system that's resilient enough. And they're also not meant to pay the price for the damage that they've caused to begin with, in many cases. But this is all about having a system that's basically focused based on regeneration, versus, it's just something that is just exploiting every last resource that the world has to offer. So, I mean, it's an interesting way of actually thinking about this particular problem in general, because what you're saying actually, and when it comes to statistical analysis, and what you were saying about statistical analysis actually relates directly to this as well. Mm-hmm. So anyway, those are just some of my basic comments. You actually just covered the idea that if you don't hold those accountable for creating the problem in the first place, then you're just going to continue to have the issues that you had to start with. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, and key to this too is the noetic rationalist idea that if something bad happens, then somebody's to blame. So you find a scapegoat, you punish that scapegoat, and then you don't change anything else. You pretend that the scapegoat willfully decided to cause problems, and you ignore all the systemic pressures that ensure that generations of new people will arrive at the exact same strategies, because the perverse incentives in their lives, cause them to converge upon that same failed strategy over and over again. It's the thing that we were talking about, fads in nutrition and diets with my stepmom the other day, and how the noetic worldview of how the human metabolism works can't stop itself from saying that food is fuel and the body is a machine. And so it's constantly trying to do simple arithmetic with calories. Maybe if you restrict your calorie intake, maybe if you fast, maybe if you do this, and it's always treating it like your body isn't going to notice and change its own metabolism in response. It's always pretending it's a machine. And if you just lower the calories, well, then you'll lose weight. It's like, well, no, then your metabolism will shift and say, I'm going to make these few calories go further. And then what happens when you bring your food intake back up? Now, all of a sudden, you're gaining weight when you wouldn't have if you hadn't done the calorie restriction in between. There's these crazy feedback loops that are involved with organisms, right? Where organisms are responding to their environment in adaptive ways that make it that the simple arithmetic of noetic prescriptions for how we're going to fix the world don't work. And yet, failure after failure after failure of noesis, moderns still can never turn and go, I wonder if I should stop trying to use noetic strategies to solve these problems. It's like, that's unthinkable. We literally can't. We can't turn and question our fundamental ideology, which is that noesis is the solution to everything. We're a hyper-logos culture. And it's not only unthinkable, it's inexpressible. We don't have in English the words to describe gnosis versus noesis. We don't understand the pros and cons of these different faculties we have mentally. And as a result, we don't even know what it is we're doing when we think or solve problems. We think it's just human nature and we're just being smart. We don't get that we're using one faculty at the expense of the other. And as a result, we're sort of exaggerating the extent to which we're cultivating or reaping the negative, the downsides of that one-sided approach to life. None of this is expressible to us. And what do we have in English to talk about these terms? Think, ponder, remember, calculate. And you can go through the thesaurus and look at all the English words for thinking or thought, and none of them gives us the ability to distinguish gnosis from noesis. So I come back to Hannah Arendt over and over and over again. We don't know what it is we're doing when we do things in the world. We are acting without understanding and without the capacity to even consider what it means. And this is why we keep repeating the mistakes over and over. It's like, someone who has anger management problems and goes and gets therapy can be taught to look at their life differently and see that they have an anger management problem. And until that moment, they thought that was the normal way everybody deals with anger. They didn't understand there even was an alternative. The purpose of the therapy is to show them other people's responses to anger as being different than their own, so that they can even conceive of the idea that they have a choice. Until that moment, they aren't an individual and they don't have free will. They're just deterministically they're being a symptom of their life strategy without knowing it. This is the Greek ethos anthropoi daimon, right? If you don't study your character, if you don't understand how it relates to other characters and what the options are, you don't even have the ability to make a choice to do something differently. You just take for granted what's familiar to you as being the way everybody does it and the only way you could possibly do it. This is how moderns are with noesis. We think thinking means systematic calculation. And so we keep building systems that pressure people to make decisions that way. And when that keeps leading to catastrophe, we will draw any conclusion except the one we need to draw, which is this strategy is bankrupt. We need to try something different. It's the trap, right? And the more clearly you can see the trap, the more you can see why Daedalus in the Labyrinth is the perfect metaphor, because Daedalus is the guy building the labyrinth. I mean, the reason he's trapped in it is every step he takes to try to get out of it grows it. He can't see the relationship between his decision making and his self-entrapment. It grows with him, but he gets out of it once he realizes he's never going to be able to walk his way out of this thing. He's just got to go a completely different direction. He gets a new dimension to his perspective, and that's the only way to get out. So, I think Kenneth Smith in this book is giving us some really good stuff here. Before I call on hands, I'm going to drop another quote from earlier in the same book. Kenneth has really chosen his quotes very well here. Gilbert Murray, the strong governments and orderly societies of modern Europe have made it infinitely easier for men of no particular virtue to live a decent life. Infinitely easier also for men of no particular reasoning power or scientific knowledge to have a more or less scientific or sane view of the world. Now, for the first 15 years that I read this quote over and over and over, I didn't understand where he was going with this. I couldn't understand what was the value proposition. What is his judgment here? Is this a good thing? It almost sounds like he's saying people who would have fallen through the cracks are now able to live a decent life. And that sounds like a good thing, right? So is Gilbert Murray saying that this is a good thing? And of course, he's not. What he's saying is people who are not fit to wield power blend in with everybody else now. We've made it very easy for people who are unfit to govern themselves or others to have all the appearances of somebody who's fit to govern themselves or others. So we hand out power willy-nilly, democratically, to whoever comes along. And then we can't figure out why we keep having terrible managers, terrible generals, terrible congresspeople, terrible presidents, terrible Supreme Court justices, because after all, our premise is that we should be able to, we're all the same. The idea that people's character determines the value of their intelligence. That you can be the smartest guy in the world, but if you've got a twisted character, all that intelligence is going to work against you. This is something that was obvious to any Greek, but is almost unthinkable to a modern. We think intelligence is like gasoline. You put more in the tank and now you're smarter. And the smarter you are and the more educated you are, the more good things happen, ipso facto. We have no way to understand how and why it was the most scientifically and educated nation in the world that caused the Holocaust. We can't grok that. That shouldn't happen according to our ideology. That shouldn't be possible. So we just disregard it. We just don't talk about it. We say, well, they were just hateful. They were just bigots. That's why it was them. But we're not bigots. So we can do all the exact same things and we'll get a different result. Right? There's this anything except coming to grips with the nature of the trap. That is modernity. Oh, yes. Okay, so Zelig, Phil, Stephen, and then we'll go to the first paragraph of today's discussion. So Zelig, go ahead, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
You mentioned, it makes me think of the way you just recently, right now said, when Paul says in one of the letters, I think to the Corinthians, I might be wrong, where it says, what good is it for me to prophesy or speak in many tongues if I don't have love? I would just be a resounding metal saying these things without any, willing to give your life for another person, right? And so that's true, right? Germany at its highest had the best technology of aviation, but yet they had no love for people that didn't look like them, right? At least those people that will push the ideology. That's very, very true. I think you have to cultivate love as to why do you want to be intelligent? It's to love your neighbor, right? That would be the Christian worldview, right? To better your neighbor, to make him wiser and not have him go through the mistakes that you've been through, right? That's the whole idea of love, right? Agape, at least found in the New Testament, Koine Greek. But then you bring up how today's societies kind of, create kind of a prescribed moral character that people just kind of put on, but they really are not in their inner lives. That, and I think of DMV laws. People follow the laws, like, they drive 24 or 45 or 50, but did they arrive at those conclusions as to why you should drive to those speeds in that particular area? No, they're just told that this is the speed that it's appropriate for this area. They never thought about why you should drive 15 in a residential, because you probably might hit somebody, but at least it's not going to be lethal. immediately, right? So they never even thought about that. They just prescribed. And I think it has to do with that Henry Ford model, that we kind of just build this line of building things where a worker no longer needed to think as to how it fit into the grander scheme of things, and it made them look like a good worker. It, as a matter of fact, it actually produced a good vehicle, and these people got discounts. But did these people actually knew anything about engineering? No, they just knew very well how to put the screw in, how to tighten it, and pass the next piece to the next person. So in that sense, I can see what you're saying, that we're no longer have people who are real engineers. We just kind of prescribe, give them a checklist, and then just, kind of assume that they know what they're doing. And then last of all, I don't know, is it me? When I think of, I was going to be a philosopher, but then first of all, it doesn't pay that much, and then second of all, like all the jokes that they're for philosophers, it's just as much as lawyers, right? Like, for example, the joke that the philosopher didn't even look at what he was going to trip over because he was too busy looking at the stars. And it's true. Like, I think philosophy is dead because philosophers, for example, I read Martin Heidegger 3 times because of the way that he wrote didn't make any sense whatsoever. He deliberately wrote in a cryptic, dark way, and it wasn't until I read larger works on hermeneutics that I realized that Martin Heidegger was a philosopher of hermeneutics. And now all of a sudden everything he writes makes sense because he was speaking of a context that I didn't even heard of before. And one of the issues that I critique people like him is, look at the advancements that we've done in our modern sciences like biology. When David Hume said that reality doesn't prescribe prescriptions, I disagree with Hume. If you look at the heart wants to pump blood. The cells want oxygen. Our system, right? Our system tells us that we shouldn't put cyanide in our food because we'll die. So maybe that tells us we should probably put into law that you should not give cyanide to people for any food business. Like, I disagree with Hume. I disagree with Heidegger in the sense that philosophy is supposed to be this thing about, oh, you can never know the truth. Well, I know what the heart is. I think we should start our politic in our society from the way our body works. And do we know the body completely? No. Just look at the brain. We probably know like 1% of how it works. But as far as what we know about how the body works, it can actually be a good model as to how to organize our societies. Like, let's start with, we should not do harm to our bodies and prescribe our laws like that. And so that's after like years of reading philosophy for like 15, 20 years, right? I'm 33 years old. And I read philosophy. I read all the moderns, or the postmodernists, the pre-moderns. And that's my critique of them, that they really, they don't adopt the biology developments to see the world and give the world morals to live by. And so moderns, we feel lost. I think as a young man myself, as a millennial, I really do feel lost because these philosophers completely just left us in the dark, right? Left us in the dark, write in cryptic ways, talk about things that are not relevant to our everyday lives. And we're more like, my generation is morally lost. Our employment levels are down, our as a young man, completely feel disenfranchised because the businesses have been taken over, because of globalism. Unemployment is pretty high in young men. Like, I'm educated, right? I was lucky, I was privileged enough to be educated, but many in my generation are not. They mainly dropped out. And so that's something that I critique philosophers for. Like, they completely just detach themselves from reality. I think that's how I feel as to how can we revitalize our modern self. Look to the body and let's try to organize from it, because it's wisdom in the body. And at least that's my perspective. When I hear about, the state of modernity, right? the state that we're in, millennials are in, that's kind of my critique on the modern philosophers.
Yeah. Kenneth Smith likewise says that, philosophy departments at universities are designed to take people who might have an impulse towards philosophy and kill it. The purpose is to entrap people and draw them away from philosophy and into academicism, so that instead of actually philosophizing, they write papers about what other philosophers said in the past, and thereby any impulse they might have had to engage in principle-driven, value-laden critique of modernity is excised and suppressed. And they find themselves talking about Kant's use of the term Begriff, and they'll make a whole career out of that. That's their whole thing. They've got this one philosopher and this one word, and now they're safely siphoned away, and they're never going to say anything critical about the banks or the ultra rich or about our tendencies to over intellectualize or anything like that. He talks about that a lot. He says, this is again something that it's hard for moderns to understand, because we think, well, was there some kind of conspiracy? What could be making this happen? We think everything's mechanical, and therefore it has no capacity to understand and adapt. So if something changes in some kind of non-healthy way, it must be the result of external forces like conspirators making it that way. But the ancients understood that human institutions and cultures are not machines, that they are organisms, and that they want to prolong themselves. And so they sense threats and they respond to threats. And it doesn't require a conspiracy to find yourself after only a few short centuries where all your philosophy departments are teaching people not to philosophize, but just to write papers about obscure points in the writings of philosophers of the past, and that becomes your career. It's not an accident, and if you take it by itself, it seems like a bold claim. But if you then apply it to every other subject, economics, politics, art, religion, if you look at every other aspect of culture and say, what has modernity done to it? Then you notice that it's not an accident that, for example, there's a Christianity among the different fragments that it's broken into. There's a large and growing fragment that's prosperity gospel that says Jesus wants you to be rich. If you accept Jesus as your savior, you'll have so much money, and they call it Christianity. And you got to ask yourself, would Jesus? If I read through the Gospels, do I see any trace of Jesus saying money's great, you should have a lot of it? And then you got to ask yourself, how complete an inversion of the religion is it for someone like Joel Osteen to convert, like a camel through an eye of a needle into money, 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 and have his followers not notice that they are now calling themselves after the name of a guy who decried everything that they're doing in their lives. You say, how could that branch of Christianity become an anti-Christianity? Well, it's the same way that how could philosophy become an anti-philosophy? And you'll see the same thing in every other aspect of modernity. Everything is bent, even if it has to be turned inside out, until it becomes reinforcement to perpetuate the great machine, right? The machine wants to keep going. And wherever, and it does this through, a kind of anti-evolutionary approach, where any place that there is, life-giving traditional impulses towards health and vitality and principles, those parts of modernity get disrupted. And so, you have to bring in the police and the military and pass laws and put people in jail until you patch over the hole and you've successfully stamped out the daisy from coming through the asphalt. Now the asphalt's clean again, right? And that response to stopping everything from growing up through the asphalt is a natural response. You could see how, to the extent that the mechanically minded noetic structure of modernity, if it is an organism the way the ancients envisioned it, it's an organism that's hostile to other organisms, and anywhere it sees organic health, it intercepts it. So that's you can find a lot on this subject in Kenneth Smith's writing, including this very book. He's going to talk a lot about what happened to philosophy, what happened to universities, and so forth, and especially when we get into the medieval section, which is much longer than the ancient section. He's going to talk a lot about the difference between Jesus's teachings, the medieval Orthodox Church, and many of the modernist branches, not all of them. Because one of the interesting things about the Reformation is some of the modernist branches are trying to reach back to Jesus's teachings, but alongside them and alongside the perpetuation of some medievalisms, you'll also find a lot of branches of Christianity that have been modernized, so that they are friendly to the market, they're friendly to money, and they're friendly to noesis. They overvalue intellect over intuition, everything that could possibly make them fit in as I would say organs, but maybe we should say mechanical units of modernity. Those changes show up somewhere. Yeah, the Protestant work ethic. There's a whole book on this, on the relationship between the Reformation and making it compatible with capitalism. Phil, and then Stephen. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I want to disagree slightly with Zelig, but not intensely, just slightly. Because I think to say that we as human beings are required to love everybody, that's too much for me. I'm thinking of because that is an intense entanglement. I'm more interested in what I call entanglement light. In other words, compassion and fairness. That is important. Because what you do is you have a light entanglement with society, a deeper entanglement for those people you truly love, and fairness, so that you have some liberty as an individual. That balance between the individual and between the one and the many is an important balance that I don't want to just like become part of the melting pot. I have my own ideas, my own pursuits, and so forth. And so that's kind of important. And in some sense, like the second point is that I agree with you that the system is like become a kind of a mechanistic Tower of Babel. I agree with that. And that, in some sense, oppress all of us. But the problem with the system is that when somebody invents something that is actually virtuous, virtue is not the same as, I think virtue is more like entanglement light. That's virtuous. There's always like people who are not virtuous, who just begin by throwing sand into the work to gum up the mechanism, so to speak. So it always falls back down. I was struck. I just this morning heard somebody talk about the carbon tray, thing. And at first it seemed like that's virtuous, you could fly your jet and you could end up with zero carbon emission because you bought it from somebody who is truly virtuous, and you even out the thing. And so you gum up the work, and now in a sense it allows you to gum up the work more until that particular virtuous part of the machine that might have helped becomes a profit motive and gums up the work and inverts it. So they have an inverted relationship. So I think, as I pointed out at some point, for the last 40 years, I've been painting fallen angels. And I told you the story about, I discovered the missing link, and the missing link is mankind, because mankind has not become human. And we are struggling to become human. None of us are perfect, but we're struggling to become human. And some people want to just be perfect, comfortable where they are, And we as a species, by the way, has a history of violence, You might wonder, there's been many, many recent discoveries that there were many, many species of humans. I should say human beings, and that sometimes direct conflict may have helped wipe them out, but sometimes just the conflict between the struggle for materials, like food sources and all that, you begin to starve out a certain population. And you might wonder, why is there only one human being, one mankind left when all these, and it wasn't that long ago, maybe 30,000 years ago, that there was still a number of human species, and then I guess when there was a lot of land, a lot of territory, they were able to exist by themselves. But as soon as they came into conflict, that's the case. And so I just wonder, like, how long is it going to be before we evolve into being humans, and we're stuck at this place where plenty of people are happy enough to just throw sand into into gear work, and and stop any progress we're going to make. And that's the problem we have. And that goes back to what Joseph was talking about. We have to have a way of not only being compassionate, but also hold people responsible for the misdeeds. And that's the problem, is that they have ended up not only gumming up the work, but they have gummed it up in the sense that they are creating the exact structure that will allow it for them to be in control. And so therefore you wonder why, like, a society, as you talked about at the beginning, turns out to be a very progressive and moving in the right direction. It gets gummed up and then suddenly it declines. So that might be the explanation, is that, people live in the short term, and why not? I could see, yeah, let's gum up the work so I could have the yacht. Like, who the hell cares about all those people who are starving? I want my yacht. So I think we have to find a balance, and it's that we need to punish the people who are gumming up the work, but they have too much power. That's where the problem is. Maybe we are at the late stage of civilization. So that'll be the end for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. There's been some interesting studies in the last 30 years in response to there's an American stereotype, which is that, okay, maybe large corporations are bad, but small businesses are the center of all virtue and innovation, and they hire the most people and blah, blah, blah. And there was a study that said, well, let's see where most pollution comes from. Let's see where most corruption comes from. Let's see where most breaking of law comes from. And they found that small businesses were every bit as likely to break the law, to pollute, to do any other thing as a big business. And it's easier to spot the big businesses because there's fewer of them. And the catastrophes they create are black swan events as a result, right? One company decides to pollute at its scale, and if it's big, boom, it affects everybody. And so we say, this is the cause of the world's problems, these big companies. But it turns out there's far more small companies than there are big companies. And even though their pollution and corruption and everything else is so much smaller and doesn't individually create any clearly discernible black swan event, nevertheless, the sum total of all of that bad activity adds up to far more than any one giant mega corporation doing something wrong. And this is like almost inexpressible in modern politics. You can't do articles about it. You can't talk about it on those talking heads news shows. You can't introduce it into a presidential debate. I mean, anybody who says this in US politics is done, because small business is the source of all virtue and goodness. You're just not allowed to talk about the fact that we don't have a small number of giant cheaters. We have a vast number of cheaters of all sizes, and our problems are a lot bigger than, if only we could round up the mega corporations and put them against the wall and shoot them, then surely goodness would follow. This is a theme that Stephen's talked about before, and I'm going to underscore it here, which is that when we think that a single convulsion where we take out a few bad guys is going to fix our problems, we're deluding ourselves. Modernity is a mode of interpreting the world that we are all engaged in. and we're all participating in it, and we're all big or small numbers or large numbers, we're all, helping to contribute to the problems that we face.
I need to respond to that quickly. I mean, just quickly. I mean, that's because the system has gotten to a point where if you want to be a small operator, you have to cheat like the big guys in order to survive. So
Yeah.
the system is like bearing down on you.
Yeah.
So that's not to excuse even the small players
Right.
from infractions, but nonetheless, it's kind of like, yeah, you have to pay the rent, you got to pay your employees and all that. So the system has, in a sense, trickled. This is what the trickle down theory really does work. It has trickled down that, to the degree that, like, they're cheating, like the only way I can survive is to at least cheat a little bit so I can pay the rent. I mean, so you're right. It does become the system, but it begins with the bad guys throwing,
Right.
sand into the gear work. So
Right.
I'll stop
Right.
there. Thank you.
Yeah. So, it ends up being a complex situation. And this issue of perverse incentives, and in what ways does the system reward bad behavior, is the thing that U.S. political culture doesn't like. We like the scapegoat. Get the problem over with, brush it away, and don't change anything significant. Just keep going the way we're going. And the fact that we will keep mass producing more people who will cause these same problems, or more companies, or that the mindset that led to whatever the crime was that we punished somebody for was not unique to them. It wasn't even just a occasional variant, but it's the primary product of the system of perverse incentives. We're all being pushed to think that way. And the fact that some of us have the resources to dig in and try to minimize how often we act on it, and other people don't, well, that doesn't help, with the long-term problem. The long-term problem is we need a way of looking at the world, and we need a system of valuing the world and each other that doesn't continually produce, bad actors. Bad actors are our that's our product's number one. What do we produce? Bad actors. And to say it's their fault and we should punish them is like only half the picture, because we produce them in great numbers. Anyway, Stephen, go ahead, and then we'll head towards the text.
I was going to say, yeah, looking at the text, it's bringing up an interesting point. That is, the medieval Christians were rationalists. When you look at the early Christian emperors,
Yes,
they were saying, we're the rational ones. We've overcome this pagan superstition.
yes,
and this is a fact. The medieval church, you read some of the stuff they're writing, it was good stuff.
yeah,
It was better than a lot of the stuff we see written today.
yeah,
But I was just going to bring up the magic genie test. The humanists keep on telling me, the idea is to offer everybody the good life. And one of the symbols of this is where everybody is flourishing. And I'm thinking the whole 8 billion of them are going to be all flourishing. Okay, cool. But the magic genie test, what do people see as the good wish? The original, the 30s thief of Baghdad, the skinny guy meets a genie and he says, oh, what would I like to wish for? Oh, my mother made really great fried sausages. So the genie, bing, gives him, a frying pan full of sausages, which are hot, he's reaching, but of course, for a starving kid in the middle of nowhere, he's suddenly back in absolute heaven for a while. There was another movie, Snow White, the Fairest of Them All, where Clancy Brown is the genie. And the guy's out in the middle of the wilderness with his baby Snow White. The mother's died. This is a variation of the story. And the genie says, well, what would you like to wish for? And the guy says, oh, I'd like a bottle of warm milk from my baby. It's starving. And Clancy Brown, the genie, the eyes just roll up the back of his head. So he gives him the warm milk, and after that he says, "Hang on a second, let me do the wishes for you." But I mean, what would a bushman who's come across the genie, you know, a Kalahari desert guy comes across the genie, and the genie says, "What do you wish for?" And the guy says, "1 million empty Coke bottles." Remember the movie? You know, the gods must be crazy.
Mm-hmm.
What are we going to wish for? Yeah, but if I was a kid, I'm going to wish for completely different things than now. What is the good life? Oh, well, according to Adolf Hitler, that's when everybody has their own, every family has their own Volkswagen.
Right.
Except today we get to the 1970s and Datsuns come out with their small car, and houses start acquiring the second car for the wife. One car is no longer good enough. What are we going to wish for? What's going to be the good life? Because I did remember reading very early in philosophy that people are never satisfied. They're always going to want more. What's going to be your wish if you meet the proverbial genie, you know? What are you going to wish for? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's and what's interesting about the genie story is that it strikes very close to home for moderns. Very close to home for moderns, because our entire civilization is predicated on the concept of meeting our wants. Right? That's what the market is for. That's what democracy is for. That's what everything is for, is to help us meet our wants according to the recipe of modernity. And thus our God is desire, right? I mean, we can say it's money, but the purpose of money is to mathematize desire. And what it's really about is getting what we want. And so, you know, what we want as a civilization is to create the perfect genie that can meet all of our wants. You know, whether we think that we're going to do that with AI and robots, whether we think we're going to do that by enslaving everybody in Africa and making them do what we say, whether we think we're going to do it by, but there's in different periods of modernity have had different solutions to producing that genie, but everybody's been trying to get the genie one way or another. I mean, each major movement of modernity is you know, whether you know, the Soviet Union went about it one way, Communist China goes about it a different way. The industrialized north of the United States goes about it a different way from the plantation south. But everybody's trying to solve that exact problem. We need a genie that's going to give us what we want. And what's ironic, and Kenneth Smith talks about this, is how moderns are so anti-philosophical that we are the least equipped people, perhaps in the history of the world, to want intelligently or wisely. We are very naive, you know, about our relationship to our wants. The kinds of philosophical warnings that Heraclitus gives, where he says it would not be better for men if they got exactly what they want. We have to be very careful about letting our wants become our gods. To a modern, that just doesn't make any sense. Nothing could, I mean, winning the lottery will solve all my problems, all of them, right? I mean, you know, other than haha, maybe for some humor value, but we really think if we just get the thing that we want, you know, our problems will go away. And so as a result, there was never anybody less well suited to be telling a genie what he wants than we are, because we are so pressured by immediate circumstances, like I have to have the warm bottle of milk right now, or else, you know, my baby's going to starve. If I can't make rent next month, I'm homeless. I mean, our horizon for understanding our needs has been pressured down into this tiny frame that lacks all perspective. It's like trying to understand the world by looking through a straw. We just don't have the necessary context. Geneva, then Donald. Go ahead, Geneva. Oops, sorry, I accidentally muted you. Go ahead and come off mute again.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I was just wondering, based on what I've heard today, but I'm just wondering, isn't it our wanting that sort of pushes the society a little bit forward? And in that forward momentum, new things are discovered. And that's sort of, I think, what Hegel meant about the evolution. Like, we're the seed, but the seed has to then become, or doesn't have to, I guess, but the seed then becomes like a fruit or a tree or a leaf. But unless we're pushing forward and wanting something more or different than what we have, we don't have that evolution. We just sort of maintain, we just sort of mock time. So I'm thinking Hegel would say, I mean, in spite of Heraclitus's warning, that part of that evolution is discovering what does work and what doesn't work. I mean,
Right.
that's all part of it. So I'm kind of not feeling like I'm going along with this. It's like, no, we're supposed to want, and we're
Yeah,
supposed
yeah.
to, yeah. So
I know exactly
guess
what
I'm
you're saying.
yeah.
It's
Like,
often
maybe
my
I'm
response
pushing
to
back.
Buddhism, right? You look at Buddhism and they're saying, well,
Mm.
just don't want anything. And you're like, well, but if like it's a period in Chinese history where the emperors are mistreating everybody, the solution is not, oh, let's just not want things. It's like, okay, this period needs to end. We want, enough seed corn to plant our crops, and that's not wrong. It needs to happen. But the issue isn't that wanting is wrong and nobody should want anything. It's that we
Mm.
need to have a understanding of which things we want are healthy for us and which things we want are unhealthy for us. We have to understand the role our character is playing in making us want one thing rather than another. So like I talk about, in these seminars, I talk a lot about the fact that I've got the genetic propensity for alcoholism. It's like on both sides of my family, going back as far as many generations as we know. My wife doesn't. So if my wife wants to have a drink of, a glass of red wine, that's great. No problem. But if I want a glass of red wine, it's an enormous problem. I have to know my character to know whether my want is healthy for me. So this is really the caution. Healthy
Right.
wants.
Yeah, but I guess
progress.
yeah, and I'm guessing at some point we don't know what's harmful until we try it and then find out, okay, well, that was the wrong trail. Let's go another way.
Yes.
And divert, let's go another trail. So that doesn't work.
Yes.
And
Yes.
without that experimentation, I'm kind of
That's right.
thinking the evolution doesn't happen. We just sort of mock time.
That's
And
right.
that, I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Greeks talk about this too from the perspective that it's one of the interesting differences between the beasts and mankind that makes it questionable whether we can justify saying the beasts are below us. Like indigenous people often say, we're not better than the animals, we're the younger brothers and sisters of the animals. They've been around longer, and when they want things, they tend to be the right things. Not 100% of the time, but like a shocking amount of the time, when a cow is hungry, it's actually time to eat. Like this is an excellent choice. But with human beings, it's hit or miss whether when I'm hungry, I should eat something. I might be wanting to eat something because I'm sad because my mom died. And I've been wanting to eat something for 2.5 years. And maybe eating more things is not going to get me over being sad about my mom dying, right? But I'm a human being and I can get crossed wires so much more easily than a cow can. There's just like something about this capacity for culture and intelligence in Homo sapiens that by wiring our wants not to our evolution and instincts, but by wiring them to our character, we both open up scope for freedom, but also scope for danger.
Yeah.
So I can
Well, I
sit here.
guess nobody said life was. Yeah, nobody said life would be easy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's what Heraclitus means. He doesn't mean don't want anything.
Yeah.
He means
Okay.
you really have to look at your own character to understand what it
okay.
means when you want something. And then you can
Got
freely
it,
decide,
okay.
okay, yeah, I'm hungry, and it turns out it's been a while since I should eat. This is a good one. I embrace this one. Let's do that. Or I just ate a complete meal, and now I saw a picture of a sundae on a TV ad, and my stomach says, yeah, let's have a sundae. This would be a good time for me to go, no, actually, I'm full. So, that want right there is not actually helping me in any way.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I'm glad you question it. We often state these things not quite right, and we need people to do what you just did and come in and raise the point. Like Phil says, I think I object in part. This is a useful function in these discussions.
I know. I love it when he says that. Yeah.
Don't
Entanglement light. Yeah. Entanglement light.
Yeah.
That was great. Yeah.
So, all right, Donald and then Phil. Go ahead, Donald.
Well, I'm a bit concerned here about what people expect from philosophy. It's not an answer book. I don't think the textbook even comes with an answer book, and there's not a textbook anyway. So I don't know. I mean, it's certainly to live the good life, whatever we might mean by that, although we think it might be something that would be a good life for us. Studying philosophy in the university, especially in a graduate school in the university, would introduce one to academic philosophy, which has nothing to do with living philosophically. It has to do with mastering some material and teaching it, passing on an academic tradition or a history. But I don't think, if we want to become better and live, that we should go read Kant or Heidegger, or even people I greatly respect, Nietzsche, Kafka, Arendt, Kenneth. It's just, you can go read. I would recommend, if you're going to read something, there's the Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he says, find a good man, follow him around, and you'll learn how to be a better one. Whether that is possible now, I don't know, but you could try it. Or the early Platonic dialogues of Socrates, where he says, he turns inward to self-examination. Much in the same way for those who are more Christian than me, and you read what Jesus says, he answers questions with questions that turn one to look at oneself.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Socrates did. There's a very Walter Kaufman, who's famous for a lot of things, saving Nietzsche for the world, wrote a critique. I can't remember the exact critique of philosophy and religion, where he talks about Buddha. Strange. Buddha didn't write anything. Jesus didn't write anything. Socrates didn't write anything. They never said, do this, don't do that. And all are considered key people that you should think about. You can't study their works. They didn't leave any, but you can think about what others have recorded about their lives in order to say, could I live like that? Or does that influence my own living? I'm just afraid that if philosophy were written down and sort of we tried to codify it, It's going to look like Aesop's fables. It's going to look like Otherwise from Kenneth, or Heraclitus's Fragments. It's not going to be anything clear enough that it's going to help you to, well, it will help you to act better, but it won't tell you before it comes time for you to act how you should act. That's going to be developing in yourself sort of the ability to read, to know your own character, to understand other characters, to know, I mean, this is like we say, we want to love other people. What does it mean? You say, well, to make them better. We have to have some idea that we get first from ourselves about what would it really be to make someone better, to truly help them in a case where, it's like, I mean, I'm starting to wander, but it's, there is nothing truer than it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted, without some serious thought as to what is really better. Or I'll take another one, like Kenneth beat me in the head with this one time, about the golden rule, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, in the hands of Adolf Hitler, you're just going to go to the oven before you get a chance to go to the oven yourself. He's perfectly willing to do that. But for somebody that understands human character, they would know how to treat you in your own, it wouldn't be doing the same actions to you as they want you to do to them. It would be finding what's necessary to help or improve you, and hoping that you're the kind of person that would find those things in them. I guess if you ever met a philosopher, maybe I did once, every time you ask a question, you don't get an answer. You get some perspective you've never thought of. You get something that is just so far beyond what your own self has been capable of coming up with about some situation, and you just get another view of it. It's like, you've got even when you've got these mythos, how are they interpreted? They're not self-interpreting. Aesop's not self-interpreting, but you'll get another perspective. I mean, Kenneth refers to this, developing this connoisseurial perspectivalism, or whatever he calls it, something like that, where you ask, what should I do? And what you don't get is, well, you should do A. What you get is a story or a response that opens up something that you've never thought about how to evaluate what to do in this situation, so that you make a better situation, so that you have a better chance of doing something good. And so when as we've heard today, a lot of people, what do we get from philosophy? How can philosophy make ourselves better? Well, it's not reading the books. Probably reading the books isn't going to help you. Try to live the book. I don't know. Enough. I'm far too serious for the level of this meeting today. I must be depressed.
It's highly enjoyable. Thank you, Donald. I know that there's hands up, but we're now at the 2-hour mark out of 3 hours. So I'm going to take us to the text. I thought, it might be time to begin talking about this book. I think a 2-hour ramp up was probably enough to get us in. And in honor of the 2 hours of ramp up, I'm going to give us one more little piece of ramp up before I take us to the text. In an act of sheer perversity, I'm gonna share this. Gilbert Murray, The Rise of the Greek Epic. If you haven't read it, and if you're interested in the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you're interested in Greek religion and the Olympian Homeric project, I can't recommend another book as highly as this one. It's early 20th century writing. Some of it has been superseded, but the core arguments are just profound. And I still don't see people, even modern, highly educated, literate writers on this subject, some of them still aren't grappling with some of the core issues he brought up in this book. And among the things that he grapples with is I'm going to say a couple of things, and this will lead us right into the paragraphs that we're going into. The first thing is, he says, the first thing to understand about the Iliad is that although it is ostensibly about the Trojan War, and the Greeks believed it was about the Trojan War, the actual text of the Iliad is not at all about the Trojan War. Every major powerful passage was stolen from some previous Greek epic about some completely different place. Like the Thebaid, which was a cycle of epics about the seven against Thebes and Oedipus and all of those people. We don't have this anymore, but we know it existed because the Greeks all talk about it. And occasionally they quote passages from the Thebaid that we now find in the Iliad. And Gilbert Murray talks about this. And he says that what happened is that once upon a time, each major polis in the Greek world had their own cycle of epics about their polis. And when the Olympian project began, they decided to come up with a shared epic. And instead of it being about the history of one polis, which would put all the other Greek polites, well, why isn't it me? They made it about an anti-Greek polis. They made it about Troy and about the collapse of Troy and how all the Greeks were involved in that. And in the course of creating the Iliad, they just stole. They stole and stole and stole and stole passages. They stole figures of speech. They stole whole sequences of events, like being dragged around the wall 7 times, the body of Hector by Achilles. That didn't happen in the Trojan War. That happened. We know that happened in the Thebaid. They stole that whole sequence directly from the Thebaid, and they changed the names because it was such a powerful, memorable event, and because it played into the lessons they were trying to teach with the Iliad. So my wife got a history major in college. And one of the things that they studied in the course of that was how the concept of history has changed over the last 3,000 years. And there was a time when the idea was not to say exactly what happened, because the belief was that we'll never know exactly what happened. The purpose of history was to teach lessons about character and principles to a new generation. And that if to do that, you had to change the events, then that's what you did. So you can see that in Thucydides. He says right at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, history of the Peloponnesian War, he says, mostly we don't know what the invading armies and the defenders on the walls were shouting to each other before the battles. But I went and interviewed the survivors, and I took notes on the sorts of things they were talking about and the general lines of their arguments. And then I freely invented the sort of speech that I think each side would have given. And I put that in my history as though that's what happened, even though that isn't what happened, because I'm the author of these speeches. And for thousands of years, people have debated, is that a good thing he did or a bad thing he did? Or, if that's not exactly what people said, is he violating the rules of history or what have you? But it really gets to this idea of, why did people tell history? Why did they tell stories? What was the purpose of religion in the ancient world as opposed to in the modern world? And in the modern world, The argument is that we are supposed to say exactly what happened. We are the bearers of truth, unlike anybody before us. We tell the truth. We are objective. We only do what we have evidence for, blah, 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 which of course, sadly, our history of journalism doesn't actually live up to that standard, but it's what we claim for ourselves. And it's therefore what we claim the purpose of history is. And as a result, that impacts our notion of what it means when an author writes a book. We think that they are creating a text, and the resulting text is then important for its own sake, and it's stable. And any deviation from the text is some kind of lie. Somebody changes the text later on, they're lying because they've altered our text. This is no longer the book that I wrote. This has now been corrupted by so-and-so. And the core point that Gilbert Murray makes in Rise of the Greek Epic, which I think if it were widely known, would radically transform the way people understand history, is that the ancients didn't envision that as being the purpose of a book at all. They didn't think that was the purpose of the text. He says, when you look at, for example, the early history of the Bible and how we have so many different versions of Luke, so many different versions of Matthew, so many different versions, especially Mark. Mark is the famous one, because the original Mark ends with the women witnessed the rise of Jesus, and then they fled and told no one. The end. That's where Mark ended originally. And some medieval monk was copying that and said, well, then how do we know any of this happened? That's not okay. The women can't have just never told anybody, because then where did Christianity come from? So he changed it. He added an ending to it, that later there was a discussion and the information was passed on and blah, blah, blah. But we know that wasn't the original Mark. None of the early versions of Mark include that. So there's a whole blooming area right now of biblical textual history where people are analyzing the use of language in early variants of the various Christian books. I just love it. It's fantastic stuff. And very learned people, Christians, atheists, they come from every background, and they're in there working the text, trying to say, this figure of speech that appears in this passage, this book claims to have been written in 75, but this figure of speech wasn't invented for 200 years later. So we know somebody stuck that in there. Or this reference to the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem couldn't have been written before the fall of the Temple of Jerusalem. And we know when that was. So we know this was inserted later, right, by somebody trying to make it. And so they basically go through the text trying to work out what's been changed, what's been inserted, and what was originally there. And part of the reason behind this is the same reasoning that led to the Jefferson Bible. What did Jesus actually say? Not what did later theologians wish he had said, and they managed to find a way while copying text to get it in there. You know, like the famous passage in Paul where he's talking about these great women prophets and how you should respect them as much as you respect the male prophets. And then the next sentence he says, women should be seen and not heard in church. They should shut up. And then in the very next passage, he's back to, among the great women prophets are Priscilla and this other woman, and you should really listen to them. And everybody looks at this and goes, obviously, some later misogynist stuck this sentence right in the middle, because if you remove it, the flow from before to after is perfect. It sounds like Paul. It sounds like Paul's other letters. But this little bit in the middle sounds like Timothy, right? Where it's like women should just shut up. Women don't know what they're talking about. Men should be in charge of everything. But Paul didn't write like that. But you can find these passages from place to place in Paul. And they analyzed and said, okay, there was a war. There was a theological struggle for the first 250 to 300 years of Christianity, where the different sects were arguing over, well, which is going to be the canonical copies of these epistles, which is going to be the canonical copies of these gospels. And the modern analysis is that it's all about politics and deception, right? Some people are lying and saying that Paul said this when he didn't actually say it. But Gilbert Murray, in Rise of the Greek Epic, has this fascinating counter argument. I say counter, but it's actually before most of these arguments. And his argument is none of these books were written as books. They're lecture notes. Every one of these traditional books, all of them were lecture notes. The concept of a book as a fixed text that has an orthodox canonical copy and every deviation is a corruption didn't exist in the ancient world. Not because they didn't respect the truth, but because written text didn't serve that purpose. The purpose of written text is I'm a prophet and a lecturer and I'm a priest and I'm going to be going from place to place giving sermons. And I need notes so I don't get lost in my sermon. And paper, assuming it's not even vellum or some, it's incredibly expensive and rare. And I can't afford to be erasing and rewriting and erasing and rewriting. So I preserve my lecture notes. And if I have something more to say, I either squeeze it in at the margin or I add it to the end. And it's why so many of the epistles have the structure of the epistle seems to be done, and now there's a new block that seems to be on another subject. And you're like, and the modern analysis is Paul has an informal, scattered style of writing, and he just writes what occurs to him. And Gilbert Murray's response is, no, he doesn't. It's later people taking these epistles as their lecture notes and adding to the end, that reminds me of a story, and I'll just put that next after the end of the epistle, right? And over time, you get this structure that is the result of lecture notes being passed down from teacher to student over time, and they grow organically in this fashion. And that was the normal state of texts prior to, I don't know, there's some point in history where people started to get fussy about what did it originally actually say, but it certainly wasn't in the ancient world. So what does that mean? Well, as Gilbert Murray points out, we can tell by analyzing the text of the Iliad and by studying the scattered references in the history that it wasn't written in 776 or earlier. In fact, there was no date when it was written. It was constantly being written and revised. We know, he says, that it was still being revised during the Peloponnesian War. We know that they were still adding major passages that we think of as the great moments of the Iliad are still being added at the time of Alexander the Great. Literally at the Library of Alexandria, there are scribes who, in the process of copying over the new edition, are revising the events and the characters. And they didn't think of any of that as deception. And it's not because they didn't understand the sacredness of the text. It's because these are their lecture notes to a contemporary audience. Contemporary events, new things have come up, and they need to be able to address those events. And they need to be able to say, what does the lesson of the Trojan War have to teach contemporary Hellenes about how to live a good life and how to be a good person? And so if, Achilles needs to say something different, then he says something different. And that's just the way it was. He says the term for all this is a grimoire. A grimoire. Anybody who's played fantasy role-playing games is used to thinking of wizards and their spell books, and the spell book is a grimoire, and that's the main place we run into the term today. But in the old days, it meant this is not written in standardized English. This is in my handwriting, which might be indecipherable to anybody I haven't taught to read it. And it's in my dialect of Greek, not Koine Greek. And the abbreviations I use, the little symbols and squiggles I use, I may even deliberately be obfuscating it so that if some other rival lecturer happens to get a glance at a page of my grimoire, he can't tell what it says. He can't steal my sermon that I'm going to give on Sunday and give it on Saturday and steal my thunder. And so when I pass it on, I not only pass the object, but I teach my student, what are all my abbreviations? What do all of these things mean? How do you read this grimoire? It's almost like a separate writing system derived from the shared writing system. And certainly structurally, it's made up of all my notes to myself for all my lectures over time. And that this is the structure of the Iliad. And this is the structure of all the epistles and gospels of the New Testament. That they are not the product of a single author, but they are the product of generations of teachers and lecturers improving upon their notes over time to try to tell a more convincing, more persuasive, more illuminating story that will help the audience to understand the point that we're trying to make. And the point might be love one another, Or the point might be, don't fight with the Romans about paying taxes. It's not worth it. Look what happened to the Jews. Just give them the money and don't worry about it and stop valuing money so much. Right? There's that sequence. There's that passage. Is that your face on the coin? Well, then it's not your coin. Don't hoard it. Give it to the tax collector. And as a result, Christians won't get in trouble, right, with the Roman tax collectors, and then the Romans will like us better than they like the Jews. This was a whole argument, right, that was going on in the first century about how to avoid being lumped in with the Jews who were being treated as terrorists by the Romans. As each generation of teachers and lecturers shifts focus and concerns, the grimoires are modified. So when a new patriarchal strain of Orthodox Christianity begins to emerge in the 100s, and they want to discredit all the faith healers and traveling preachers and so on, well, of course, they don't hesitate to insert some new words into Paul's mouth. Don't listen to those crazy traveling women preachers. They should shut up in church. You should trust this dude over here. He's the one who's blessed and will tell you what Jesus wants you to do. There's these revisions that are happening, reflecting the different concerns at the different periods. So if we understand these texts in this way, then from the perspective of the Olympian/Homeric project, it means that knowing that the Greeks were deliberately cultivating their own religion, starting around 776, maybe a little earlier, that they were deliberately teasing out new lessons, like Oedipus Tyrannus and Oedipus at Colonus. They're finding ways to draw new stories and new lessons out of the old material, to give new lectures, to illuminate people in new ways. Then we can understand that, in effect, and this is hard for a modern or a medieval to fully understand. You really have to sit with it. That in the course of it, they're changing the nature of their own gods and their own religion by exactly this process. Incremental revision in light of new lessons learned that you want to pass on to a new audience. So now it would be better if Zeus didn't say that, if Zeus said this instead. Because when everyone thought Zeus said that, they all sacked their own cities and caused a dark age. So maybe it's better if Zeus didn't say that. Maybe Zeus should say persuasion, not sacking cities. Persuasion is how you're going to be great. And a new generation of Greeks goes, persuasion. Okay, let's try that. You see how different your relationship is to your gods when you think that you're not lying by changing what Zeus says, the way that you would be lying if you changed what God said in Genesis, right? It's a different orientation to say these gods, these polytheistic, naturalistic gods of the ancients aren't supposed to be dictating terms to the cosmos through their sacred word. What they're supposed to be doing is translating an infinite nature that human beings can't understand into a series of mythic but finite stories that even the dimmest person could start to go, oh, so maybe I shouldn't eat my neighbor. Okay. Right? There's this translation role. And if the translation works better to have the God say something different, then it's holy to revise what he says, not blasphemy. You see the inverse relationship about the role of the divine and what it means for a God to have said something. This is all at work in the paragraphs we're about to go into. When we started this ramp up, the thing I most wanted to get to is this part right here, that as we read about the Olympian religion, we got to be reading about it from this perspective of Gilbert Murray and his insight into the nature of the text. Go ahead, Phil. You've been waiting a long time.
Yeah, before you said that, I was actually going to respond to both Donald and Geneva, but I think it bears some resemblance to what you just said. What Donald essentially is saying is that there's a difference between a question and an answer. And that the question is really the secret to what thinking is, what the mind is. Because the question is about the relationship between the known and the unknown. And it opens it up. Whereas the answer is like, oh, we already know that. I knew that. Don't tell me anymore. I knew it. And so we have gotten ourselves to a situation where we have, by giving answers, then in a sense, we have made, maybe not intentionally, but maybe so, people are unable to think because they can no longer ask a question. It's just, let me know what it is. I'll do what you say, you know? And so giving that part away by making it easier, because you now don't have to think, it's taken away the deepest aspect of what humanity is that's different from other species. Now, I'm not going to say none of them know how to think, but that is our one pet trick that we have over anything else. So that's important. So therefore, you are left in philosophy not to give answers, but to further the mystery by laying it out as a continued question. Ask it yourself. Figure it out on your own. That's returning power to you that you might feel, well, this is a damn burden, man. Why don't you just make it easier and give me the answers? I'll be a good follower. So that is actually to reinstate your humanity, because now you have this ability to think and perhaps move into the future. And that drifts nicely into what Geneva was talking about. Isn't that about exploring the possibilities of like developing? Okay. And the difference between that is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is knowledge of the way things are, or maybe I should say the realities. Wisdom is about the psychological dimension of how to deal with the existential reality. Because you have to also control your own ability to circulate these questions and thinking, because there is a gap. I call this the ontological difference between knowing and not knowing, and knowing and the instantiation of that in existence. And wisdom is the thing that, in a sense, understand that your understanding does not totally match what it is, but in a sense, you have to, in a sense, control your psychological dimension of wants in order to match what is possible. So there's difference. You could be very knowledgeable, but you might not be wise, because you do not know how to control your psychology, which is about your own internal wants and desires and all these things that drives you. And that's important, because like the manifestation, particularly when it's constantly changing, and part of the, by the way, the manifestation is that the psychology changes the conditions as it evolves. So the ontology of that is this. You know, I just a couple of days ago, I kind of had a bit of a dispute with somebody about, you know, the realities, and, you know, we were talking about mathematics. And he said, well, let's get down to something simple. We could all agree that 2 + 2 is 4, right? Yeah, okay, I'll agree with that. Maybe not an absolute term, but that's a pretty firm foundation. I'm not going to argue with that. But however, how that applies into the existential world is different. You lend me $2, and later on you lend me another $2. That's $4. 6 months later, I give you back $4. We're settled, right? No, no, no. The condition had changed. The interest rate has gone up. And I have given you only $3 worth of purchasing price.
Right.
And you're going to ask me, like, you owe me another $1. I said, what the hell are you talking about? We do agree that 2 + 2 is 4. And you agree. But that's not reflected in the reality of the existential condition,
Right.
which has now changed.
Right.
Now, let's make that more serious. You could say, well, he's a friend. I'm not going to bicker and be a stupid idiot about a dollar between a friend, right? Let's make that $20,000 plus $20,000.
Right.
Okay, now it gets serious. I pay him back. I pay you back $40,000. And he says, you owe me another $10,000. I said, say what?
That is a lot of money.
I know. Say what? And he tried to explain to me, and I insist, 20,000 plus 20,000 is 40,000. That's the baseline. We're going to go with it. Okay. You're going to make him pay, or you're going to say, forget it. I'm going to forget. You're no longer my friend. And so it's interesting how the existential conditions changes the paradigm that we have in mind as
Yes.
a construct of knowledge.
Yes.
So therefore, you always have to equivocate between the idea and its representation in existence.
Yes.
So I thought I would address that issue.
Thank you.
I think that's important. That is why when you ask me for another $10,000, you are actually operating on a dimension of wisdom. Yeah,
Yes.
we know there's something else going on, but I am insisting on the rules of the numbers. Okay,
Yes.
so I'll just say that's kind of important, and I think that kind of applies to what you say in a general way. I won't go into that now. So anyway, I'll just say that now. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I think so. Now we're ready to do the text, and we have a half hour left. So let's dig into the text. 1/6 of today will be about the text, but really everything was ramping up to this point to be able to read this. So here's the first half of the paragraph that we're starting this week. Greek myth was the confluence of many folk tales and the assimilation of one deity to another, nearly the same. Anybody who studied Greek myths, more than a little bit, quickly discovers there are alternate versions of the stories. And the deeper you go into the Greek myths, the more alternate versions you find, until you eventually realize every village and town had their own versions of Athena, some of whom had different names, some of whom were born in different ways or to different parents. Like, all kinds of things are different. And you're like, how can these all be Athena? And the answer is, now we begin to get to the nature of Greek mythology, the artifice of the Olympian Homeric project, in which all these different tribal deities were being welded together into a shared pantheon. It left seams everywhere. I mean, people joke about how Zeus couldn't keep it in his pants, but that's because Zeus had to stand in for every chieftain god from all the different tribes. And the chieftain gods married different people because they were different people themselves. And next thing you know, Zeus is sleeping with everybody, because what we call Zeus was actually all these different deities, many of whom might have been faithful to their single companion, right? But now that companion is just one of a list of people that Zeus has slept with. So that's an example of some of the seams. And another example of some of the seams is, well, how can the myth end? Sometimes this person lives, but sometimes this person dies. Or, like if you dig into Athena, you will find that there are alternate versions of the myths where Athena's dad is not Zeus, but Athena's dad is Poseidon. There are older stories where Athena's father is Poseidon. And that's why Athena, the famous myth of Athena and Poseidon struggling for who gets to be the patron of Athens, comes into play. Then it's daughter succeeding father, right? And who gets to take it over. It changes the tone of it completely. And it's a little more weird and arbitrary if you accept the later synthetic version that she's descended from Zeus, which was necessary to wield the Olympians together. They had to make it be Zeus later on. And then if you dig further, you discover that actually originally it wasn't Poseidon at all, it was Tritonus, right? Who was a Titan, who was supposed to be Athena's father. Back from the days before there was an Olympian religion, back when it was the religion of the Titans, which we alluded to last week. Which means Athena's older than the Olympian religion. She goes back to the religion of the Titans. And of course, her mother is pretty consistently said to be Metis, thought, forethought, or wisdom. And she's a Titan. So it makes a certain amount of sense that her dad might have been a Titan too, and that she predates the Olympian religion. But if you go back even further, none of these people are her parents. And she's the great goddess Athena, who was the patron goddess of Athens. Above all, that was who she was. You go back far enough, you discover every one of these city-states in ancient Greece had their own eponymous goddess that they were named after, dating back to when tribes first settled down, decided to make a city in a place, and they named the city after their own tribal totem. So there is like layers and layers and layers to Greek mythology. Some of the most fun versions of the Greek myths that you read about are happily play with all this material. It gets so much richer than one simple version of a story that has a beginning and a middle and an end, when you start to discover that these stories have changed over time. And thus they sort of occupy a superposition of many different stories at the same time, and you can navigate them many different ways. So this is what, when he talks about, the way that there was this confluence, this is part of what he's talking about. If you haven't read them yet, Robert Graves' The Greek Myths is an excellent book on this subject. Each little section gives a capsule telling of a myth, and then it's followed up by note after note after note after note with alternate versions of the same story. And where did they come from? Oh, in this village on this river, they say she didn't die. She actually was raised to the heavens. Oh, in this version, Zeus wasn't her dad. I mean, Graves will list all these alternate versions in a way that where most other tellers of the Greek myths are suppressing the alternate versions to try to make a simple story. And it turns out to be a lot of fun when that stuff gets foregrounded. But the real book that Kenneth Smith recommends on this, and let me see if I've got it right. Roberto Colasso wrote a book called The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. I don't know if I've got his name right here. Let me just check Wikipedia real quick. Roberto Colasso. Yep, I got it right. I'll give you a link. There we go. He does a unified story that takes in the alternate versions as part of the story. And the book opens with "in the beginning," and then he'll tell you an early Greek myth. And he'll take the myth down to some weird thing that happened. And then he'll say, why did that weird thing happen? Because I didn't start back far enough. So let's try again. In the beginning, and now he'll tell an even earlier myth. And now by the time you get to the end of that, you're like, oh, that's why the weird thing happened in the earlier version. It was being aligned with this, But then that one ends somewhere weird too. In fact, his whole first chapter is just this over and over and over, digging back farther and farther and farther in the history. And he ends up telling this whole story that from the beginning to the end of all of these chapters, it all makes sense and it all holds together in some kind of crazy world of people shifting and metamorphosing, and where early blessings and curses stay in the family lines throughout the whole history of archaic and classical Greece, and they can never get out of the fate of their character. There's all kinds of Heraclitus in this. There's all kinds of, it's fantastic. So when he's writing about the Greek myths the way he is in this paragraph, you know he's read Robert Graves' The Greek Myths and he's thinking about it, and you know he's read Roberto Colasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, and he's definitely thinking about that. All of these things are undertones to this paragraph. So then he says, myth is itself a Greek term describing a story or account that attempts to explain a subliminal kind of order, a subliminal kind of order, which even after this formulation will remain mysterious and dark. This is just a fascinating sentence. There's so much to it. Here we're dealing with the interface between the finite and the infinite, and we're dealing with the interface between the conscious and the unconscious. Subliminal, he's alluding to the preconscious or unconscious, the vast part of our character and our mind that we aren't thinking about right now. And maybe we don't ever think about it except when we're asleep and we're dreaming. But it still affects us and influences us. It shapes our desires. It shapes what we notice and don't notice. He's talking about, you know, what Jung would later call the collective unconscious, but he's talking about it in a specifically Greek formulation. What is all of this non-rational stuff that shapes our rational thinking without our understanding it? And part of what he's alluding to here is that the problem of logos culture is that it wants to lay bare everything into little logical syllogisms and equations, but the rational mind that satisfies is a tiny percentage of our mind as a whole, and it can't account for our dreams and our longings and all the other things that according to Heraclitus are riding on our back like a daimon. The things that are actually the gods of who we are left out of all those rational descriptions. So we need a way of accounting for things that can take into account that non-conscious infinite. And here too, this boundary between the finite rational and the infinite irrational, it isn't just a fact of the human mind that we just have to deal with. It's unfortunate, but there it is. It is, according to Kenneth Smith's existentialist critique, which is based on this Greek critique, it is a necessary and inescapable feature of human psychology. We wouldn't be able to think at all without it. And the reason is that you can't represent the infinite with anything finite. There is no one single correct perspective on anything, because human perspectives are finite. They're always distorted and warped and limited by the fact that we only account for 7 plus or minus 2 things. And since there's an infinite number of things to be accounted for, we effectively suppressed almost all of reality to call attention to the handful of things that our little model has decided are worth talking about. And there's no way that the 7 plus or minus 2 things, no matter how carefully we pick them, are going to accurately represent the whole picture. Every model, every theory, every idea, every perspective a mortal can possibly have is a massive distortion. So finite explanations, logical, tidy, everything ties up cleanly. Any explanation like that is going to misunderstand most of reality. It will only be able to understand little fragments or aspects, like E equals MC squared, right, is true in a rationalist, finite way. It can only account for one aspect of reality wherever it occurs. But it's not going to tell you what to say on a date. And it's not going to tell you whether it's safe to have a drink of red wine. Like all these other things about life are left out of E equals MC squared. And this is the nature of all logos information, that it is restricted and limited in its capacity. Myth is another way of knowing that gives us the ability to refer to not only the unconscious in a way that can pull us together as a person, so that our conscious and unconscious minds can dance well together, but it's also a way to try to harness the infinite into a finite story that's like the finger pointing to the moon, that alludes to the infinite, that guides us to what we should be paying attention to instead of the things we were going to put in those 7 plus or minus 2 slots in our head. Maybe we should be thinking about Athena, right? Maybe there's a reason why this happened. If you ask yourself the questions that the myth makes you ask, then it will open up new perspectives, like Donald was talking about. Philosophical wisdom is not the kind that gives you the answer. It's the kind that helps you ask better questions. And it does that by being the finger pointing to the moon. So before I go to the next sentence, let me call on Phil real quick. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I have a quick question to that. I mean, it's a little bit, just a little bit complicated. I mean, does grouping in a sense mitigate that to a certain degree? Let's say you have we know that, for instance, when you remember telephone numbers, 342 968
Right.
4386, right? I mean, so the manifold of that grouping have you subdivide it into smaller groups, and you remember the smaller groups within the seven, no problem. To a certain degree, I'm not going to say that's a complete answer. But the other thing I want to ask is whether the grouping in terms of orchestration is not another way to approach it, right?
Right.
You have these different groups, they're playing, but orchestration does not get to an absolute answer. It just gets to a harmony.
Right. Right.
What is the other way to approach this kind of grouping thing in terms of multiple? Once again, not infinite, but a large number. You could have you could have a orchestra of, like, say, 101, and plus the chorus and all that. So in some sense, you're actually saying the model is between social security numbers and telephone numbers and things of that sort versus orchestration.
Yeah.
Which is really the logical way of approaching that, and the sort of like mythic way of approaching that. That's all I wanted to ask. So that's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's right on the money. There's a lot of tricks that can be used by a finite mind to try to reach further than you would think you can with 7 plus or minus 2 things. I'm going to use a quick metaphor that Donald will be familiar with. In computer science, they teach us a lot about transformations and whether they are and methods of representing information. And to represent information in a way that works in a computer, you have to transform it. Right? You can't represent it as it actually is. You have to encode it. And the challenge that all software engineers are always struggling with is this transformation lossy or non-lossy? Right? And a non-lossy transformation is one in which the code captures all the information. And so later you can perfectly recreate the original information from the encoding. You haven't lost anything. It's non-lossy. But if you don't get that right, then translating it into the encoding and then trying to translate it back to the original value ends up being lossy. And you've lost something. And the question for a software engineer is always, is the thing we lost something that we decided was important to preserve so that we're sorry that it's a lossy operation? Or is it something that we didn't need? And so now we say, well, that doesn't count. So this is a non-lossy operation. All transformations are going to be lossy in some fashion. But if all we lost is stuff we don't care about, then we call it non-lossy. So 2 classic examples. Something that photographers are keenly aware of that a lot of non-photographers don't realize is that the very best computer monitors in the world can't represent a lot of colors that you can nevertheless see with your eye out in the world. And it's true of film as well, that there are colors that you can capture on film, a really good film, that you can't actually represent on a computer monitor. They're part of the electromagnetic spectrum, but the mathematics we use to encode colors is those equations actually leave out part of the color spectrum. And there's no way to represent them unless you develop a new equation for color spectrums that is not as lossy. Some of that's in the blues and some of that's in the greens. If you go to Wikipedia and look at color encoding, you'll see kind of weird little amorphous shapes showing here's everything the human eye can see, and here's what can be captured with this outstanding film, and then here's what your monitor can show. And you can see that there's colors that it's just plainly obvious. There's colors you can look right at, and then you look at your monitor or your phone that you're holding up to try to capture it, and that color isn't on the screen. It's a lossy transformation. The classic example is translating voice into text. So what Phil just said, anybody who's had the privilege of listening to Phil knows there is this warmth and humor right? That's that, and thoughtfulness that's not conveyed by the words, but by the tone of voice. And you can hear when he's smiling or just finished laughing when he says something, and audibly we get that information, and thus we know that he meant something humorously. But if we just transcribe the words, that tone of voice is gone, right? English, unlike the system developed, the polytonic system developed for representing ancient Greek, the system for representing English in writing doesn't include tone of voice. There's no way to tell, unless you're lucky, whether some words are meant seriously or humorously or sarcastically or what. And I'm really aware of that when we're doing these classes and I'm walking you through Kenneth Smith's writing, because like Phil, Kenneth is a man who likes to laugh, and he finds a lot of stuff hilarious. I mean, like really funny, and not hilarious in a bitter, biting, wow, I can't be around this guy because he's cynical. But I mean, really funny. He finds a lot of this stuff really funny in a sort of, sometimes in a rueful, I can't believe I went through 3 decades of my life not understanding that, and the day I finally figured it out, it changed my life. And now I see the humor in the human condition that I couldn't see when I was taking myself too seriously when I was younger. And that stuff is all threaded throughout this text, but you can only see it in the text if you've heard him talk enough that where's the funny parts. Sometimes
let me just interject a small bit there. I once asked a Greek guy, he was my teacher, like, we all have the expression, well, that's all Greek to me, right?
Yes.
And I recently heard somebody, read some Greek text with the tone inflections. And I said, well, what do Greeks say? They can't say that's all Greek to me. He says, that's all Chinese to me. Which was surprising. Like they both have tone relationships. So
yes.
I just thought I'd throw that in.
Thank you. Yeah, that's good. So we'll come back to this text in a second. I'll call on Zelig first, though. Go ahead, Zelig.
Yeah, I heard one of my professors in Spanish say, I speak English to do business, and I speak Spanish to speak of love. And it's true, English, there is no different. Like we all speak to each other as if we're equal in English. That's something that I came to kind of become aware of. It's true. Yeah, I think touching upon mathematics, right, being a standard to understand the world, I think that with Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the whole premise that you could actually explain the world was completely demolished. I think Kurt Gödel put a final nail to this thesis that Bertrand Russell and Frege were trying to develop, a perfect language that was purely logical, purely mathematical, like how to prove that 1 + 1 = 2 rigorously. And here comes Kurt Gödel and says, well, you're assuming your first principle without proving it.
Right.
and it makes me think of Aristotle, when Aristotle said, well, how do you prove that the law of non-contradiction is valid? And Aristotle pointed out the fact that you cannot prove it. You have to take it as true, because if in the pursuit of trying to prove the law of non-contradiction, you're using the law of non-contradiction.
Right. It assumes itself.
And so you're using the axioms, right? And so axioms are, mathematics is axiomatic. But I'll do what Phil kind of did with Kenneth Smith. I entangled myself a little bit. I would kind of push on the idea that we can't make general statements. And the basis of that is, I see the heart, like the needing for the heart to pump blood, the cells to get oxygen in every age, whatever the myth was at the time, even in our own world with our own myths, right? So I think ultimate statements, general statements are possible purely from biology, though. I don't think any, I agree with you, as far as culture or taste, I think that's impossible. But as far as general statements, for example, I would say a heart will always want to pump blood. Our cells always will want to get oxygen. And so we should seek to give that to the bodies. I think those general statements are universal. I don't think those are situational. So I'll entangled myself a little bit there with Kenneth Smith, because I kind of hear my antennas go up when I hear stuff like that. I'm like, that's Jacques Derrida's deconstruction, postmodernism, and Foucault,
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought it up. I mean, this is part of Kenneth Smith's line on this, is that gnosis and noesis are both faculties of the mind for a reason. Each one has strengths, but each one has weaknesses, and they're really well situated to critique each other. So the problems of generalized statement, the power of generalized statements is clear, right? And it comes naturally to human beings to make generalized statements. But the problems with generalized statements come along with the strengths. You get both at the same time. They're neither good nor bad. Again, law of non-contradiction, but they're both at the same time. And so, where the power comes in, according to Hegel, is when you harness them to each other into a dynamic system so they can critique each other, and that's your natural way of dealing with things. So, the knowledge that the heart is pumping the blood was something that had to be discovered. People before that time had a lot of different ideas about how blood worked in the body that they thought their way to, and they made generalizations about. And they would make these general statements, and they were just dead wrong. And it wasn't until later people were able to observe the human body more closely, to set aside their theories and generalizations and immerse themselves in the details of the life of the body. And I'm going to use your theme of the body here. They said, let us think less about the body and experience the body more and study it. And what do we find? And what we find is, oh my God, the heart is pumping the blood. And I can't remember if it was Galen or somebody before him who was the real person who did the breakthrough. But when they had their breakthrough, they immediately began telling everybody, oh my God, can you believe the heart is pumping the blood? That's how come your blood moves? This is amazing. And this epiphany was possible because they were able to critique their earlier noetic generalizations by using new information gained from gnosis, from experience. And this is the kind of salvation of the weirdly twisted structure of the human mind, that noesis can help us escape the trap of parochialism that gnosis invites us into. And gnosis can help us escape the trap of irreality and abstract generalizations that noesis invites us into. As long as we harness them to each other, they each contain the antidotes for the other. So yeah, he would be saying it certainly generalized statements come easily to us, and generalized statements that have a greater degree of accuracy, we can use gnosis to find them and sort them out from the less realistic generalizations. We can critique generalizations and find better ones. And that Gödel may be right that we're never going to get a perfect perspective or model for the reasons that he laid out. But that's a different question from, can we come up with a model better than the one that we have right now? And the answer is often, yeah, we can do better than we are right now. We may never get it, because we are finite beings. We may never be able to hold an infinite reality, but we could have a better finite model than the finite model we're using at the moment. So all of this is being caught up here. So when he's talking about the purpose of myth, part of what he's talking about is this problem of the conscious and the unconscious. Part of what he's talking about is the difference between the finite and the infinite. And as a result, we talk about the way that Greek myths are often about the gods or the demigods, the heroes that were descended from them. If we understand that subject matter as being, how do you best translate the complex infinities of nature into a form that finite human beings can digest and understand, and can help us to keep us from all running off a cliff or into a dead end, that this is the purpose of myth. And that he's saying, for this purpose, the tool of myth is a better fit than logos is. There's lots of things that logos is good at. If you want to be a great shipwright, if you want to be a great sculptor, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to be a trader, so all kinds of things in life where logos is perfect. Math and logic are your friend. Consistency and replicability are your friend, and you need logos for that. But if you're trying to figure out your general orientation in nature And are we even making the right kinds of decisions overall? Logos isn't going to get you there. You need mythos to help you, because that's the problem of translating the infinite into the finite. And Logos is no good at that. That's not what it's for. So this is what he's talking about when he says, even after this formulation, it will remain mysterious and dark. He means it will remain resistant to being representable in simple equations and logical syllogisms. That there is a huge bonus of the irrational that's required to understand nature. Nature is under no obligation to seem rational to us. It has its own logics that are not finite human logics, but are divine, infinite logics. And the rules they follow were not designed to be friendly to us. And so there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to use non-contradiction and addition and other simple tools. It's why Heraclitus revels in paradoxes, is to rub our face in the difficult interface between finite people and the infinite cosmos that we're trying to understand. Any one finite perspective will have some strengths and some weaknesses. And that's okay, as long as we learn to become a connoisseur of perspectives, like a great craftsman who wants a toolbox full of different tools so that he can think about problems from different angles. In the same way, we want to fill our minds with different perspectives and learn to be good at lots of them, so that when we meet a problem and we detect the inadequacies of the perspective we first brought to bear, we can critique it by looking at the other tools we have available and saying, well, maybe I shouldn't think about this like a modern. This particular problem doesn't lend itself well to the modern perspective. Maybe I should think about this one like a medieval. Maybe issues of grace and faith and spirit are a better way to understand this particular problem. Or maybe I go through all of the tools in my toolbox and I conclude that I need a new perspective and I need to engage in some mythic work to come up with a new way to understand this previously never before encountered situation that none of my tools are ready for. And the last thing I'll add to that before we go on to the next sentence is Kenneth Smith will caution at this point that it's dangerous to treat ideas using the metaphor of tools. It's okay as a door to get you into the room to start thinking about the value of different perspectives. But the critical thing to understand is a tool is like a thing. This is a noetic way to understand worldviews, like things. And that worldviews are not things from the ancient perspective, they're organisms. And that when you pick up the hammer that you think is a tool, you discover that it wields you as much as you wield it. The distortions that are introduced into your understanding of reality, where everything starts to look like a nail, is a consequence of the fact that the worldview of a hammer is very different from the object of a hammer. And the worldview changes you to fit the tool every bit as much as your grip is trying to, make the tool fit the job. The abyss looks back. Yeah, this is a critical thing. There's all this sophistication to the ancient worldview that's hard for moderns to accept, when you think that instead of everything being made of things, everything's made of organisms, and they're all responding to each other and shifting and changing all the time. It's a weird, slippery, protean kind of nature that results from that. All right, so that's that sentence. Next one. In myth, men accommodate their intuitive minds. He's talking about gnosis here, and he's talking about the unconscious. They accommodate their intuitive minds to forms of order that nature itself imposes on them. What he means is ideology is not what defines our intuition. The rules of Euclid and mathematics, the rules of logic, these are not where our intuition comes from. Our intuition comes from the fact that we went out into the garden every day and we did our weeding and we worked on the plants and we figured out what they needed. And over time, the plants taught us a new way to think about gardening by where they would grow and where they wouldn't grow and what the insects would do. We experienced nature. We were open to the experience. We let it fill us with gnosis. And that gnosis creates over time an intuition that's harmonious with the gnosis. And it might take us years or decades or never to come up with logic and equations that can explain why this gnosis is right. But the gnosis is right? The lived experience of life aligned us with life in ways that we may not be able to verbalize or model or explain. Logos lags behind gnosis, because gnosis is the older faculty in all animals. It predates our species. Nature has been refining and evolving gnosis as a faculty, intuition as a faculty, for far longer than it's been evolving logos. Logos is more of an experiment. Noesis is more of an experiment than gnosis is evolutionarily. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, something I was working on years ago. I was trying to understand. Well, we have world conceptions, and we have tools, mental tools, and mental tools aren't world conceptions. A world conception will state something about the world. The rationalist will state the world is ruled by underlying principles. That's saying something about the world. So rationalism is a world conception. Science isn't a world conception. If science was ever prejudiced like rationalism, it wouldn't be science. Science isn't about being prejudiced as to what the world is, and which is exactly what they're doing now. But what's the other thing opposite to science? Well, religion. But what is essentially religion? Religion is not always about gods. You can be an atheist and be religious. Religion is mysticism, and mysticism is an opposite path to science. A mystic, a scientist, he goes and pokes the world to see if it bleeds. A mystic is the opposite. He lets the universe poke him. He lays on his back. Come along, big universe, make love to me. He's allowing himself to be impressed by the universe. And the modern is telling us that this way of doing things is nonsense. No, it's a secondary, very important tool in our nature.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, there's a lot of profundity to the gnosic approach to life that is inexplicable from the Noetic perspective. It just looks like irrationalism. And that's what modern scapegoat as the source of all evil is, irrationality. You know, we when we want people to shape up mentally or culturally, we tell them to be rational, as though that were the source of all goodness. So next sentence, myths reveal oblique and difficult truths about human nature and about the peculiar warpage that specific appetites and ambitions lay upon human intelligence. So what is he talking about here? Oblique and difficult truths. Oblique to whom? Well, oblique from our worldview, right? Our worldview causes us to see some things clearly and see other things distorted and see most things not at all. And it has to be that way. The only way you fit an infinite number of things into 7 plus or minus 2 slots in your brain is by suppressing almost everything as background. The foreground background operation is critical to the process of thinking. Without it, we couldn't think at all. So the question is, what are we going to treat as ceteris paribus to be ignored? And what are we going to treat as the critical properties to be attended to? And our worldview, whatever that selection is, it means that our worldview is going to allow us to notice some things, but really have a hard time noticing others. Anything that our worldview habitually discards as background is the parts of nature that when they're the important part that comes to play in determining who we are and whether the things we try are going to work or not, our worldview will seemingly fail over and over to understand why things came out the way they did. Because after all, the critical property is the very thing our worldview was suppressing. It's like something invisible somewhere reached out and changed our fate. And it seems unfair. It seems irrational. It's a necessary side effect of having a worldview that a lot of truths are oblique and hard to notice. And what's powerful about myth is because myth being gnostic, being mystic, to use Stephen's term, to be more mystic, it has a greater ability to let the infinite of nature reach us through gnosis. And so things that were oblique from a rational perspective and hard to notice can come into focus through a clever metaphor, through a finger pointing to the moon. Oblique and difficult, right? Difficult because whatever the rational systems of thought and logic and mathematics are that we're using to try to understand things, those again are optimized for certain parts of reality, and other parts of reality they can't seem to get a grip on at all. So whenever parts of reality seem to obey the law of non-contradiction, our logic and math have a great time. Okay, this is good. We can quantize this. We can say it's true or false, or it's good or bad. But whenever we're talking about a part of reality that doesn't fit the law of non-contradiction, we find it difficult to think about. So it both is and is not at the same time. I step and I do not step. Well, Heraclitus, shut up. This is nonsense. It seems like contradictions. But what Heraclitus is saying is, this is a truth that your logic is having a difficult time with. But if you can put the logic on a shelf for a moment and pick up your mythic mind and look through those lenses, you will discover that it's perfectly understandable that the river is changing while you step into it. So you are stepping into it and not stepping in, and you're stepping into a different river at the same time. And likewise, you're changing at the same time. So the you who began the step is a different person from the you who finished the step. And the encounter with the cold water, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where you get these cascades coming down off of glaciers and mountains, will take your breath away. And whatever you were thinking about a moment ago is gone. The instant your foot descends into the water, you literally are thinking about different things halfway through the step than you were at the beginning of the step. Your concerns are very different now. And if it's a powerful current that might sweep you away, you have a completely different set of concerns. Explained in these ways, and not intended to limit it, but just to point the way towards the ways in which there is an infinity of powerful qualitative experience in reality, in actuality, to use Kenneth's terms, that's waiting to inform the mind, helps us to understand why logic and mathematics, laws of non-contradiction, can be blinders and cause you to fail to attend to what is actually the most important thing about the experience of stepping into the river. I have a friend who lives in Anchorage, Alaska, who says every year a certain number of people die of drowning in Alaska. And most of them die not in rivers, but in water running down the street and going into a drain. Because they don't understand how, as the glaciers melt, a rapid torrent of water could be only a foot deep and yet still be enough to sweep you off your feet and take you away. So they see the water running down the street and they think, I can just step in that just like I can step in the shallower water, but they're wrong and they die. Their rational mind has fooled them. The concerns that they weren't concerned about the right things. The rational mind didn't prepare them to understand the qualitatively different experience of the extreme speed of these runoffs, which they've never encountered before and which the rational mind was not prepared for. But a myth about somebody being swept away in a dramatic fashion can lodge in the mind of a child and stay with them for the rest of their life and keep informing them, despite the fact that their rational mind is saying, it's fine, right? It's no problem. But then their brain goes, but what about Icarus? I remember that Icarus fell, his wings melted, and I can't get the image out of my head. It's addictive. And that addictive, persuasive quality is critical to making it be a myth and not being a logic. And therefore is critical to it overriding the ego's feeling of power in selecting which 7 plus or minus 2 things to attend to, feeling that it must be right by definition because it's looking at what it wants to look at. And Gnosis reminds it, what you want is not the sum total of the picture. It may not even be the most important part of the picture. There's a painting attributed to Bruegel. I think we talked about it last week. I can't remember. That Auden wrote a poem about. how much it struck him. I think it's about the Metropolitan Museum is the name of the poem. And in this, it's a huge canvas. It's gigantic. And there's all kinds of people doing different things in this painting. And you have to study it a long time to notice that far away in the corner, in the back, there's a leg coming out of the water. And the title of the piece is, Icarus falls from the sky. And in the painting, everybody's going about their lives and hardly anyone notices that it's even happening. It's like something could be happening of truly epic proportions that will change the way people look at the world for the rest of time, and still at that moment using their noesis to decide what's important, or even using naive forms of gnosis that are parochial. People can fail to notice the most important thing that's happening, and that's the natural state of things. This is some mythic wisdom right there. So I'm going to wrap up. Phil, go ahead. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to ask a question that might or might not relate to this. I think it does, but it might not. I was in a meeting about Kant, and we talked about the synthetic a priori. And it came to the point where I asked a question, and I said I had a specific question about Johannes Kepler. Before Kepler came along, Galileo, the not the Persians, but the Middle Eastern people, the Islamic people, have discovered that planets move in orbit, and that move on to Copernicus and then Galileo. But the orbits were sort of circular, were round, circular. And not that Kepler disputed that, but he was observing one of the planets and he plotted it very carefully. And I guess what would nowadays call the dot plot. And it turned out it was, like an ellipse. And I had the thought experiment and said, what if he never connected it? Did he discover that synthetic a priori? Or did I discover it when I said, oh, that's an ellipse? He just had the dot plot. Who actually articulated that secret, the hidden secret that he discovered? So that's interesting, do I say, oh, yes, go and proclaim to the world, I discovered that planets move in elliptical orbits. I'll give a little tagline to Kepler, like, thanks to his help. Am I being like a fraud? Or did I actually say, oh, yeah, that's an ellipse. So they move in elliptical orbit. He just had the dot plot, and that was like that. So that is, to me, maybe the relationship between, intuiting and sensing the thing and just conceptualizing the thing. So could you say something about that? Because it relates to this, not in a mythic way, but there's that gray zone that it seems to be about the relationship between understanding and just like an image that's not even complete. Okay, that's all I want to ask.
Well, and that goes hand in hand with this issue of, if we don't even have ways to conceptualize that gnosis and noesis are different faculties with different strengths and weaknesses, then we've never developed the skill of distinguishing which one we're using at any given moment. And since we don't know which one we're using at any given moment, it also means that we don't know which weaknesses to watch out for, right? Because if we know that we're using naive gnosis, we know what its weaknesses are. We know to watch out for parochialism and generalizing too much from personal experience. We can be cautious about that. But if we don't know that we're using naive gnosis, we may be confident that it's impossible for us to make those mistakes because we think we're doing something else. The same is true of naive noesis, right? If we are theorizing about the ellipse based on how a circle works and how we think an ellipse works, and we think we've made a discovery that way, we may think that's what we're doing because we've forgotten that when we were younger, we had the experience of reading the other writer telling us what it's like and living through that experience and learning through gnosis. So we think we're engaging in noesis, and we attribute to logic and our own reasoning what actually was an experiential discovery long ago that we forgot about. All of this comes hand in hand with, if we are not crisp about these faculties, and if we don't practice always asking ourselves, which one am I doing now? And what weaknesses is it prone to? Then it means like Oedipus, Tyrannus, doing our very best will end up blundering because we're not doing what we think we're doing. We're not in the situation that we think that we're in.
So are you saying that we need 2 legs to run?
Yeah. 2 legs to run, baby. That's right. And we need the language to be able to say, what is running? What are legs? What am I doing here? So that while our body's running along and our unconscious is happily running like it's learned how to do, our conscious can be going, I wonder if I'm doing this right. Am I wearing the right shoes? Should I be cautious in these pebbles coming up ahead? I can critique my operation and refine as I go, but only if I know what I'm doing. And if I think I'm doing something, if I think I'm on a bicycle when I'm not, well, I'm going to draw all kinds of false conclusions, aren't I, about what's likely to happen and what my mistakes could be. This is the human condition in a nutshell.
It's purely the middle stage, according to Oedipus. That's in the bright daylight of manhood.
Yes.
We're in the third phase where we have prosthetics. We
Yes,
call
the
it
king.
technology.
Yes.
Or Moorcock called it the sword stormbringer. Who was master, sword or swordsman? Is our technology going to rule us?
This is what we want to know. Or rather, this is what moderns don't want to know because they don't like the question. Which is, obviously we're in charge. Obviously our technology can't rule us. Everything is fine. Nothing to worry about here. All is well. So on that note, I guess we will wrap up for now. I'm trying to copy the text and I'm having trouble this week for some reason. So I don't know if David Royal can copy the text out of the meeting chat before we go.
Yeah, it's
Otherwise
working for me.
Yeah, I say select and it goes, I mean, no. I know what you want to do, but you can't.
Hey, thanks. I just want to make one comment to what Donald about the statement of the golden rule: do unto others as they will have done to you. That works fine, except for the fact that, what if I'm a masochist? Should I start whipping him? Because I will want that done to me. So that breaks down even there.
Yes.
That's a golden rule that works between 2 good men or good people. Doesn't work between evil people.
Right.
Doesn't work for the fox and the stork either.
Yeah.
Well, so there we go.
Thanks a lot, guys. It's been good.
Thanks, everybody. And yeah, David, if you could snag that text and send it to me offline, maybe by email, I'll save it off. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Sure, everyone.
Bye, Rick. Bye, Phil. Very good today.